Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, it had been a tumultuous journey. My clapped-out, cheap, second-hand Ford Mustang was certainly not made for dirt roads as precarious as this. It may have weathered many storms in life, but an unforgiving road did not accommodate vehicles as run down as mine was. My exhaust pipe spat out grey wisps of murky smoke in protest, smelling ominously like burnt rubber, while my cantankerous petrol gauge was beginning to flash its warning lights on and off. It had been guzzling up petrol as fast as a starving dog. If I didn't find the Green Ivy Cemetery any time soon, let's just say I could be stranded on this god-forsaken road without a solitary soul in sight for miles, and God only knows where the nearest gas station was. It was so isolated in these parts. The nearest town was probably miles away, I couldn't be sure. You could cut the rising level of tension in my car with a knife. As Lacey, my mixed breed, half St. Bernard and Pyrenees mountain dog mix, had picked up that things weren't going terribly well for me. She may have been scared about many things, but that dog knew when I was upset and tangled up with the tentacles of my own frustration. I'd been stuck in my god-forsaken Mustang for what seemed like hours, and poor Lacey was champing at the bit to stretch her long, lanky legs and answer a much-needed call of nature. I was driving around in circles. Lacey knew it, and more to the point, so did I. At least she commiserated with me, giving me an encouraging lick, but nothing was soothing the annoyance bubbling up inside me like a pressure cooker. The atrociously misleading map I had followed was doing my head in, driving me completely nuts. In truth, I'd been thrashing it belligerently against the dashboard in my heated exasperation. I came a hair's breadth from tearing it up into shreds, but it was my only hope of finding the Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery. Without it, I'd be doomed, as in those days the luxury of GPS and other navigational tools were all but a pipe dream. As for the truculent, intractable roads in this part of Montana, did anyone even bother to name them? Or was that just too much to ask? I mean, maybe locals to the area knew about these roads that went on forever without a single soul in sight. But did they not even stop to consider visitors to the place, who, when they were lost out here, may as well be stranded on a desert island with a couple of coconut palms for company? I knew this beloved Mustang of mine, that had once belonged to my father, should have been serviced a long time ago, but money, it was in short supply, and my pockets were very shallow. So servicing this ungainly, battered lump of steel was going to have to be put on the back burner for now. My priorities came first, like a roof above my head, food in my belly, and gainful employment. Those things would be nice. Once I'd acquired those 3 basic necessities to human life, then I could consider the frivolous, extravagant indulgences and luxuries of car maintenance, but not at this point in time. Although I could predict what any car mechanic would ultimately say to me when I brought my car in for servicing, I'd seen it all before. as they stood there in their denim dungarees, looking at me pitifully through steely eyes, as they cocked their heads to one side when they examined my battered Mustang, as if they were viewing a dead fish that had passed its best and was beginning to stink. They would lightly raise a brow, rub a finger across their lips, and maybe make an uncomfortable noise in the back of their throat, and say, "Sir, I don't know how to tell you this, but this Mustang of yours is about to peg out. Don't waste your time or energy spending supercilious money on it. You should sell it for scrap metal and be done with it." But if you're as hard up as I was at this moment in time, you didn't have the privilege of parting ways with an almost deadbeat car. So why was I out on this remote country road, looking for Green Ivy Cemetery, you might ask? I was escaping my mother, of course, and the uncomfortable, almost intolerable living conditions of remaining under her uncongenial roof, that of late had become significantly more suffocating. There was nothing wrong with the house per se. On the contrary, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a sumptuously cosy home. But the problem was my mother. The two of us could never see eye to eye over anything. I was 27 years old and had flunked the last year of college, so staying at home was not going to be an option, unless I wanted the proverbial dragon breathing down my neck all the time, making my life a living hell. I can honestly say, sleeping in my Mustang would be preferable to sharing a house with that woman and her now insufferable partner that had recently moved into my old family home and made herself very comfortable, thank you very much, in our home, like an ugly cockroach infesting the area under your kitchen sink. And let's just say, with that capricious woman around, the overwhelming need for me to leave home for good had become urgently more pressing. In those days, some of the people in our small rural American town described my mother as a witch, and it didn't help that she owned a black cat called Sooty. I get why people thought my mother was a witch, because she looked like one. She'd never visited a dentist a day in her life, so she had a toothless, rather gummy smile, and grey hair that was long and straggly, that hung limply around her face like an old dirty mop. My mother also possessed unusually bizarre facial features, a long face, a pointed chin, and an awkwardly protruding beak-like nose. And worse still, she had two sizable, very scary-looking black moles on the side of her cheeks, from which long wisps of hair grew that she refused to ever pluck. It didn't help that my mother wore a long black dress every day of her life, pinched in at the waist and flaring over the ankles. She told me she wore black to hide the dirt, as it was so much more practical, but wearing a witch's tunic every day certainly meant that the rumours about my mother abounded like an unbridled Californian wildfire. If that wasn't bad enough, on her feet she wore the most ugly lace-up boots you've ever seen. Practical, I believe she called them. I had dreams about creeping up to my mother's bed in the middle of the night to furtively cut away those ugly hairs from her moles. But she always moved around restlessly in her sleep, and would not have been best amused to wake up in the night with her son dangling over her with a pair of scissors in his hands. My mother had heard somewhere that removing mole hairs was not a great idea, but had it not occurred to her that a trim might be a good idea? It was embarrassing when people's eyes would gravitate towards my mother's ugly moles, with a look of unadulterated horror on their faces. I'd seen how my mother's mere appearance literally scared away some of my school friends, who asked me if the rumours were true, with wide, frightened eyes. "What rumours?" I asked them, looking bemused. "Is your mother a witch?" they would whisper, in low, hushed tones. "I heard your mother was a witch." I was to learn one of the women in town, a lady called Mrs. Margaret Sanderson, had told her two children, whenever they were naughty, that she'd send my mother to cast a nasty spell on them if they misbehaved, because my mother was an evil witch. In the beginning I told the kids, "No, absolutely not. My mother isn't a witch." I soon began finding that having a witch as a mother did have its rather unusual benefits. So I affirmed to my classmates their very worst fears. Yes, the rumours were true. Mrs. Sanderson was absolutely right. My mother was an evil witch. She owned a black cat called Sooty. That part was at least true. My mother cooked all kinds of treacherous spells in her cauldrons that gave off green, vaporous, repugnant smoke, I told them. I thought she had a flying broomstick, as I thought I'd seen something black flying past my windows at night. Suffice to say, they latched on to my every word, saying, "I knew she was a witch! I knew it!" Suffice to say, when Tommy Ellis, for example, arrived in our small town, far too big for his own boots, I might add, he strutted around the place like a stuffed penguin that had eaten far too many doughnuts. He had spent some time living in Boston, and was under the impression that he was a superior species to the rest of us simple townsfolk. I have to say he had an attitude of self-entitlement. Let's just say all the boys in my class were awestruck by Tommy's confident bravado, and tall stories he fed everyone about having travelled the globe, visiting all kinds of exotic places with his father, as his parents were divorced, so his mother had moved back to her hometown, which was why he was now living in our part of the world. He made it very clear he was a large fish from a very large pond, who didn't take very kindly to being thrust into a small pond with the rest of us. His cocky bravado had persuaded my classmates that being from a university town like Boston made him some kind of a celebrity. It meant that many of my classmates thought he was so cool they wanted to befriend him, in the faint, unlikely hope that some of his sparkling gold dust of good fortune might just rub off on them. Personally, I think Tommy Ellis's nose was as long as Pinocchio's, and his fictitious stories were all made up to impress us so that we would like him. I was to find that the little cunning snake in the grass had decided he was going to hijack my best friend from me. And alas, my gullible, impressionable best friend Neil seemed to be biting the bait, and I could sense I was losing his close friendship to Tommy Ellis, who was blowing out hot air like a pufferfish. He told my friend Neil, "If you become my best friend, I'll take you to Boston with me to see my dad. There's an ice cream shop there. They have over 800 different flavours of ice cream, and you can choose whatever flavour you like. I like bubble gum, and I also like licorice all-sort ice cream and peanut butter with lots and lots of jelly buttons. If you drop your friendship with Howard and we become besties, my dad will take us to the best places you've ever been to in your entire life. In Boston there's an old haunted dungeon. We might see the ghost of an evil landlord. He killed several of his lodgers there. They say people have been pinched by him when they navigate that dangerous dungeon, and some have heard his disembodied voice of the landlord. His name's Barker Wallace. He screams into their ears, 'Get out! Get out!' Let's just say my best friend was caught up in Tommy Ellis's duplicitous fishing net. It was up to me to rescue him from such a grisly fate. He was hanging on to Tommy Ellis's every word, and let's just say the dungeon with the ghost of Mr. Barker had left my friend Neil drooling to go to Boston. I couldn't allow that to happen under any circumstances, so a boy's got to do what a boy's got to do. I told Tommy Ellis, in no uncertain terms, if he didn't leave Neil Fleming alone, because he was my best friend and not his, my mother would turn him into an ugly toad with one of her magic irreversible spells. And get this, he absolutely believed me, so he left me and Neil to our own devices, to hang out together. And he had poached somebody else's best friend instead, a young boy called Clive McGovern, who told us he had indeed been to the dungeon with Tommy Ellis in Boston. He had been pinched by the ghost of Mr. Barker, and had tasted an ice cream flavour you simply couldn't get in our small town, called the secret mix. I gather if you could guess what was in the secret mix, you could have as much ice cream as you liked for the entire summer. But no one ever guessed the clandestine ingredients, as you would correctly assume. Ostensibly, from thenceforth, Tommy Ellis never imposed on our friendship again. Then there was the class boffin, Rachel Turner. Now that girl was clever. She grew up to work for NASA, would you believe? When I learnt that, I wasn't remotely surprised. You get clever, and you get genius. Rachel was the latter. She was brilliant at math. The kind of super kid that could tell you the answer of a mathematical equation in her head without needing to write it down on paper. In truth, she was brighter than our math teacher in school, because she corrected her once. "Miss Maggie, you got the math wrong. The answer is 83. It's not 72. I remember Miss Maggie looked like she'd like the ground to swallow her up whole. "Why, I do believe you're absolutely right, Rachel," she squirmed. "It was an oversight on my part, of course." I told Rachel very artfully that if she didn't help me with my math homework, my mother would turn her beloved spaniel into a dragonfly. And so for a long time Rachel practically did my math homework for me religiously, without even batting an eyelid. And my grades at school, thanks to her, had been transformed from a mediocre C to an A+. And the miraculous climb to stardom almost impressed my mother, but I say almost with a pinch of salt, as nothing ever impressed that condescending woman. Suffice to say, my mother may not have been a real witch, but she certainly cast a spell of doom over our lives, which is why my father left home as fast as a jackrabbit when I was barely 2 years old. I'd have done exactly the same if given the chance, but as a kid you can't exactly choose your parents. But now at 27, I hope to leave my small American town for good and never go back there again. It wasn't the town that I despised, it was my mother. When I told her I was leaving, she actually helped me pack. She said she hoped she never saw me again, and she really meant it. I didn't take offence. My mother's words were always cutting. She had barbs on her tongue, poison in her belly, and had been stinging me all her life with her cruel jibes, like a great big Portuguese man of war. For some reason we were like oil and water. We never mixed. Worse still, she didn't like my dog Lacey at all, describing her as an ugly flea bag. I found Lacey when I returned from college, lying on the side of the road, surrendering her soul to the earth. The dog was starving, her thick coat matted and filthy, covered in fleas. She looked up at me with the saddest dark eyes I've ever seen, and then lay her head back on the ground, as if resigned to her miserable fate. In that moment I knew I had to help her, and help her I did, although I wasn't sure that the dog would pull through. But I could only try my best to save her. I picked Lacey up in my arms. She was so light as a feather. There was no meat on her at all. When I brought her into the house, bathed her and fed her, my mother was far from amused. "Get that ugly thing out of here at once," she said to me. But I firmly stood my ground, and slowly but surely Lacey began to blossom, like a dead tree in the woodgrove that you think has given up the ghost, suddenly becoming alive with a plethora of blossoms in spring. Lacey's transformation was miraculous. Her coat gleamed, her eyes sparkled with rejuvenated health, and she was a happy dog. "Sorry, Mum, but I have to put my foot down. Lacey is staying, and there's nothing you can do about that." "Fair enough, but as long as you don't bring that thing anywhere near me, it's quite grotesque. I don't want to have anything more to do with it." Slowly and surely, Lacey began to regain her weight. Now she was an attractive-looking dog, who saw me as some kind of superhero for saving her life. The two of us had become inseparable, and everyone who encountered Lacey asked where I'd found such a superb-looking dog. But I never told them Lacey's story. My dog deserved to keep her dignity intact. After all, no one needed to know that she'd been willfully abandoned and left to die on the side of the road. Let's just say I might have saved Lacey, but there were many times after I'd flunked college that this exceptional bundle of fur had actually saved me. "You're just like your bloody father," my mother would tirelessly rant at me. "A chip off the old block you are. No wonder we don't get along. Why I married that man all those years ago, God only knows." In truth, I think my mother absolutely hated all men, full stop. And in turn, they never liked her. She made no secret about the fact that men were an inferior species in her opinion, and it was just her rotten luck that she ended up being saddled with a boy and giving birth to one to boot. "I only kept you because I thought you were a girl," she told me. "If I'd known you were a boy, I'd have dragged drain fluid just to get rid of you." My father, who now lived in Wyoming and was happily married with a wife and 4 children, who were my step-siblings, told me that my mother belonged in a funny farm, and not to take any notice of her unkind words. I'd have happily moved in with my father, but for some reason, possibly to get her back on him, out of spite, my mother had insisted on keeping me. "I think your mother needs psychological help," my father told me. "In truth, I think she might have been abused by her father when she was a little girl," he shared with me. "That's why she lashes out at men. You know the saying, hurt people, hurt people. She thinks we men are all made of the same cloth. She despises the lot of us, making no secret of it. I imagine you being male puts you in the unfortunate firing line of her abuse." He wasn't wrong about that. Suffice to say, in the last 5 months, my mother was now in a relationship with another woman, who was so sour she could make milk curdle, and I mean that literally. I never saw that venomous woman smile, not even once. She wore a frown on her face as if it had been stamped on her skin with superglue. She had slit eyes which were buried beneath her eyelids, like flat dashes, a rounded face and spunky hair that looked like it had been electrocuted as it stood up on her head like a series of twin peaks, which she dyed this ugly fluorescent green colour, just to draw attention to herself. I'm sorry, but no one dyes their hair a sickly putrid green, unless they want to be noticed, unless they want to be the centre of attention. Worse still, she had piercings in every available orifice, and was covered in skull and crossbone tattoos, as if she rather fancied herself as a pirate. She dressed like a man, looked like a man, behaved like a man, which I found so ironic. If my mother hated men so much, why was she in a relationship with someone who could almost be mistaken for a man? Her name was Kirsty Rawlings, and I have no idea how my mother met her. She'd been a prison guard in a women's correctional institution for over 20 years, and she was one hell of a scary woman, and I don't say this lightly. But the men in our town wisely kept a safe distance from her. I was told Kirsty used to beat up the female prisoners, and was known by them as Creepy Kirsty. In those days, embarking on an openly gay relationship with another woman didn't go down very well with folks in a very small conservative town like ours was. So it was hardly a wonder that the gossip in our small town centred over my mother and the strange woman with the green hair she'd shacked up with, who had moved into our lives like a hideous piece of furniture that you found at the dumpster that you'd seriously like to throw out if given half the chance. Worse still, everywhere Creepy Kirsty went, the locals would stare at her with gog eyes and open mouths, as believe me, no one had seen such an idiosyncratic character in our town before, with green spiky hair covered in angry tattoos and unattractive piercings. I couldn't blame people for staring. She was so wacko to look at. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be unkind, but she absolutely was. I do not know what my mother saw in her, but then maybe two oddballs have a great deal in common. Kirsty would contemptuously spit on the people in town. Her spittle was like chewing gum. It had a long firing range, and almost always landed on people's cheeks, like a dog's drool. "What are you looking at?" she'd spout like an angry kettle. "Never seen a woman with green hair before in your life? In your sad little life, your sheltered life, have you? Is that it? Poor little you." I don't believe my mother was ever gay. If anything, she was heterosexual, but a lonely woman, who'd have secretly enjoyed a relationship with a man, but could not overcome her deep-seated prejudices against the male species. So to subdue her loneliness, she had settled for a woman who looked like a man. It's a little like someone who tells the world chocolate cake is so terrible for you, you should never eat it. But behind the scenes, they're longing for a slice of chocolate cake more than anything in the entire world, and are far too proud to admit it to anyone, least of all themselves. So what do? To compensate for their deprivation, they settle for a mop version of chocolate cake, made with cacao, a cocoa alternative, that is just not the same as the real deal. It was a bit like that for my mother, I suspect. I glanced up at the pewter sky above my head, which was in a dismal mood. It spat very fat raindrops onto the windscreen of my Mustang, which was all I needed right now. Was it threatening to rain, I wondered? Please, God, no. It was bad enough navigating dirt roads wrinkled with cracks and potholes, than anticipating driving through puddles of water any time soon. if suddenly it decided to bucket down with rain, especially when my petrol tank was running low. The year was 1982, and this part of the world was as alien and unfamiliar to me as the skin on my back, but I'd welcomed getting as far away from my mother and her absurd relationship with creepy Kirsty as I possibly could. It was more a gut feeling, or a hunch if you like, that enabled me to take an obscure fork in the road that finally led me to the sizable cemetery. I drove through a large open black wrought iron gate with a sign on the outside that read, "Green Ivy Cemetery, visiting hours 7:30 to 4 p.m. I drove down a well-worn asphalt drive towards an old red brick building with sash windows and oakwood doors, with a sign on the outside that read, "Caretaker's Office." I was here with barely a teaspoon of petrol remaining in my tank. Even though the impulse to turn around, reverse, and leave this place was extremely strong, I wouldn't get far on a tadpole of gas in my tank. So I was resigned to stay here, even if I wanted to flee as fast as a cheetah. Sometimes we have to stop where the dice lands on the gaming board, whether we like it or not, as our choices have run as dry as an empty tankard of beer, and are as parched and thirsty as a barren desert. I climbed out of my truck with a huge measure of reluctance, slamming the door behind me. "You stay there, girl," I told my dog Lacey. "I'll be back in a moment." Lacey responded with a couple of barks that sounded more like a reluctant grimace. Lacey was sometimes afraid of her own shadow and would run away from trouble rather than face it. She was a lot like me in that regard. Lacey was a large dog, but she had run away from chihuahuas and miniature Pekinese before at the park, terrified they were going to bite her, when she towered over them like a mountain lion. Lacey was larger than your average St. Bernard, so she was huge, and for some unfathomable reason was obliviously unaware of just how massive she actually was. She was so intimidated by anything that moves, and small things overwhelmed her. I've seen her running away from a squirrel, and to see a dog that size fleeing something that tiny is amusing at the very best of times. I didn't like being in a cemetery. I mean, who did? It's not exactly the most auspicious setting, is it? I remember when I was a boy, I heard stories about graveyards, and they were never good. Many of the most horrifying movies are centered around cemeteries, aren't they? Where ghosts and ghoulies carried around hacksaws ready to turn you into hamburger meat. Or graves in the middle of the night that would suddenly crack open, and the corpses of evil murderers would rise from the dead to unleash their wrath on the living. Spine-tingling stories that, although delicious to listen to over a campfire while roasting marshmallows and eating s'mores, is a whole lot of a different ballgame when it meant you had to hang out among the graves indefinitely, which is what my new job entailed as the new caretaker of Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery. When you're as desperate for a job as I was, well, beggars can't be choosers, can they? So the advertisement I'd seen in the paper for a caretaker had ticked all the boxes for me. It would mean free board and lodging and a paycheck at the end of the month, and that was a good start. The sprawling graveyard stretched out before me, and it was impressively large. There were narrow asphalt roads and neat little stone paths, which were surrounded by plots of green grassland that was begging to be mown. The grass-covered expanse boasted a plethora of trees that littered the landscape, softening the morbid appearance of the cemetery with their towering limbs and sculptural boughs that were bejewelled with lots of green leaves. There were overgrown beds of rambling roses that looked like they hadn't seen a pair of pruning shears in hundreds of years. There were headstones of all shapes and sizes, peeping through the ground like jagged teeth and diseased gums, and some of those stones were so weathered with moss and lichen that the names of the deceased had long since been wiped away by the hands of time. That was when I saw the oakwood door of the red brick building open, and a man trotted down the steps towards me to meet me. He was in his 50s, I guessed, as his greying temples and slightly receding hairline gave the game away. He had brushed some of his hair from the back of his scalp towards the front, to hide the progressive baldness that he was developing. Why did he do that? He wasn't fooling anyone. The bald spot on his head actually quite suited him. He looked quite debonair, wearing a tweed jacket, white shirt, a pair of caramel-coloured chinos, with a pair of very shining-looking boots. He gave me the once-over. I was conscious that I didn't look my very best. I'd been travelling for ages, and so I guessed my clothes must have looked a little crumpled. But if he thought I looked a little bedraggled, he graciously said nothing. "I'm Harold Kelrow," I told him. "People call me Hal for short. I'm the one that's accepted the caretaker's position at the cemetery. Are you Mr. Chester Huntington, the attorney for the trustees of the cemetery?" I asked him. I was told I could meet him here. He'd show me around the premises, tell me what's what, show me the ropes and that sort of thing, so to speak. At first, the debonair, somewhat eccentric stranger did not answer my question, but promptly removed his round steel-framed spectacles from his face. He spat on the glass lenses with his spittle, using a handkerchief he pulled out of his pocket. He wiped the lens glass clean and replaced the glasses back onto his face. "Ah, that is so much better," he sighed. "My view of the world gets distorted, very clouded, when I don't clean up my spectacles. But you have not changed, have you? You are still much younger than I expected you to be. Most of our caretakers here have been in their 50s, 60s, or 70s. But you look like you're in your late 20s, am I right?" "You are right about that, sir. I'm 27 years old. But I really don't think age is significant for a job like this. I'm sure I'm quite capable of doing it." "Are you the attorney, Mr. Chester Huntington?" I repeated. "The one I spoke to on the phone the day before yesterday, about the job." "Do I look like an attorney?" said the man, looking rather amused, as the corner of his lips twitched up, and his blue eyes twinkled mischievously. I shrugged my shoulders, not knowing what to say. I didn't want to cause offence. What did attorneys look like anyway? I'd seen law students at college who were navigating their career paths, and there was nothing that stood out about them from the rest of humanity, so to speak. "No," he chuckled. "If you must know, I am not an attorney. But no one has ever thought of me as an attorney. A mad poet, perhaps, but not a man of the law. I couldn't think of a more mundane profession. But it attracts people because of the money," he said, pinching his fingers. "That's why people bite the bait, don't they? To go into professions like that. But not me. No, I'm a free spirit. The one the system never caught," he said, unable to disguise the pride in his voice. Did that mean he'd never been to college, I wondered? He looked very well educated to me. "The name's Glenn Clanhannon, and you are Harold, am I right? Harold Kelrow. We've been expecting you. Chester Huntington, the attorney you spoke to about the caretaker's job, is my cousin. I told him I'd show you around the place so you can get settled in comfortably. Chester is out of state at the moment on other matters of concern, so he couldn't be here to welcome you, and asked me to apologize on his behalf about that. Come with me," he said, beckoning me into the red brick building. "Let me show you around the place so you don't get lost," he said teasingly. "So why do you want a job as a cemetery caretaker, young man? If you don't mind my saying, well, it is rather a peculiar job for a man like yourself to take. Shouldn't you be at college studying, or considering starting a family, perhaps?" I could have given Glenn a litany of excuses about why I was taking up the caretaker's job at the cemetery, but I'd been through all that with Glenn's brother, the attorney Chester, and so I just decided to be brutally blunt and to the point. "Well, I need the job. It's as simple as that. You know the usual story. Money's a bit tight, and I figured that this would be a job I could do. I mean, it sounds pretty straightforward, and with a roof over my head, it's ideal for me." Glenn considered my words carefully. "Well, yes, you're right. The job is easy. You could probably do it standing on your head. You need to manage the gardening team when they come in, and tell them what is to be done. They're lazy buggers, those three brothers are, who need a kick up the backside, they do. If the truth be told, no one likes to employ them in town. They're bone idle, but Chester refuses to sack them. He's got a soft spot for their mother. They went to school together, you see. and came very close to tying the knot. If the truth be told, I think he's still in love with her. You need to make absolutely sure those lazy sloths get pruning those roses, mowing the lawns, weeding the graves. I have a credit card for you, courtesy of the trustees of the cemetery, to cover any expenses you might incur, which you must record in the logbook with receipts to make sure they balance. And this is the key for the petty cash box, in case you need to pay for something with cash. All your expenditures need to be recorded. Chester is very particular about that. He doesn't like it when the numbers don't balance. You can use the checkbook to pay your salary into your account every month. All the checks here have been signed in advance by Chester, so you need to fill in the blanks, and it's pretty straightforward. They're very trusting around here. The cemetery's credit cards or checks will cover maintenance costs, so that if the lawn mower needs a new part or fitting for the garden hose goes awry, you can resolve the issue yourself without bugging Chester. If there's a problem requiring significant expense, you're going to need to run it by Chester first, so he can get the trustees' approval. It's important you open the gates of the cemetery early at 7:30 sharp, and lock them at 4 p.m. every afternoon. Do not allow anyone on the premises after 4 p.m. or earlier than 7:30, and I don't care what excuses they have. Don't let anyone in the premises when they're closed. It's important because anyone visiting the graveyard at night, well, then they're probably doing so nefariously, aren't they? Maybe to put graffiti on the graves or something. We had a problem with that years ago. So since then the gates are closed fastidiously by 4 p.m. It wouldn't hurt to walk around the cemetery in the evening and morning, just to maintain a presence on the property, and just to check up on the cemetery and observe what needs doing, and so forth. You can answer the phones in the janitor's office, take down any messages. If a funeral's been arranged, the funeral home will contact you and organise the grave diggers and the ceremony. You don't need to be involved in any of that, of course. On occasion you might get a stranger asking you for a map of the cemetery, he said, opening a drawer and showing me a plethora of leaflets. Give them one of these. Pretty straightforward it is. You may also get someone asking you to locate the whereabouts of a grave. That never really happens because most people know where the grave is that they're looking for. But you'll find the locations of graves listed in a very large book. We've got several here, he said, pointing to a shelf of oversized books, easily the size of a medium-sized painting, that I observed dated back to the 1700s. You just look up the details based on the date the deceased died, and, of course, their surname. It should be easy for them to locate the grave. The roads and paths that weave themselves through this cemetery are very clearly marked. You won't get many inquiries. That's why we don't have a separate site office, nor do we employ someone to twiddle their thumbs all day. That would be futile, and a complete waste of money and time. Glenn looked reflective for a moment, as his steely eyes fixed on me. In a sense, you're a little like a watchman, as you just need to pay attention to things. It's a very old cemetery, and we only get a handful of burials here every month, sometimes less, so it's not a busy place. For a young man like yourself, it might get quite lonely. But there is a television set in the bedroom, and there's also one in the lounge that you can watch, and an old radio in the kitchen that has seen better days. This red-bricked caretaker's house will be your living quarters, and there's a fully equipped kitchen with a stocked freezer. But I'm afraid it's all very basic, rather rudimentary, you could say. Nothing sumptuous about living here. Are there any more questions? He asked me pointedly. I've got a dog with me. Is that a problem? I'm afraid I forgot to mention it to your cousin. But Lacey goes with me everywhere. She's a good dog. We're practically joined at the hip, if you understand what I'm saying. Glenn frowned for a moment, running his hand through his bald patch. We don't really welcome pets here. But if you clean up your dog's doodah, and make sure he doesn't or she doesn't lift her legs up on the gravestones, That should not be a problem. Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate that. I think I can find my way around, as you said. The job is pretty straightforward. I'm pleased to hear you say that, Howard. If you need to contact me, my number's in the phone book by the telephone over there. One thing, young man, if anyone digs up a gravesite and a body, I mean if that were to happen, then it must be replaced in the grave at once. The family of a deceased loved one would only get grievously upset if a grave is decimated or tampered with, if you can appreciate. If that happens, give me a call, and we will discuss what to do in the circumstances, he said, giving me a wink. Sorry, I said. I don't understand what you mean. If anyone digs up a body from a grave, I must put it back again? I mean, surely no one would do that. Isn't that sacrilege? Glenn looked a little evasive and uncomfortable. He shifted awkwardly on his feet and turned his head away from me, pretending to focus his attention on a damp spot on the ceiling. Well, if it happens. Just supposing it does. That's all I'm saying. I mean, you know you've got to cover every eventuality, have you not? I mean, maybe a trickster playing a macabre joke, if you know what I mean, decides to dig up one of the dead bodies in the graveyard. You get seriously sick people out there, don't you? He pointed at the damp spot on the ceiling. Get that looked at, he said. Looks rather nasty. There must be a leak in the roof or something. Good luck, Howard. I hope you will stay longer than the other caretakers. I'm afraid too many of them have not lasted the entire month. I hope you'll settle down here very nicely. I've got a good feeling about you. Sorry, Glenn, I don't mean to butt in there, but what do you mean the previous caretakers didn't last a month? I asked, looking bemused. That's crazy. Why didn't they stay here longer? Glenn looked a little evasive for a moment, as if he didn't want to answer my pointed question. He rubbed his hand over his bald patch again, and said obsequiously, Well, you know how it is. You know what people are like. They get so freaked out about cemeteries, don't they? All the rumours and speculation about places like this. I mean, it's easy to feed an overactive imagination if you really want to. You hear a noise, you think you're being haunted, when in reality it's probably just a tree knocking against the window pane, he said, pointing to the oak tree that stood on the rear side of the red brick building. That tree over there gives us a lot of problems, he said, shaking his head. It's not very good for a fertile imagination, I'm afraid. I told Chester we needed to cut it down. It's the cause of many people being spooked, I am quite sure. Chester loves that tree too much, refuses to cut it down. You look to me, Howard, if you don't mind my saying so, like a salient, sensible, very prudent young man, who has his feet parked firmly on the ground, and is not given to spurious suggestions. So I'm sure a few ambiguous noises you might hear during the night aren't going to easily unsettle you. Remember this, that there rarely is normally a practical explanation for any noise you might hear. So don't get beat up about it, or you'll do what the others did, run away, and we don't want that to happen. Oh, don't worry about me, Glenn. I'm not easily spooked. I don't believe in ghosts and ghoulies anyway, even if I am going to be living in a cemetery. Glenn nodded at me and gave me a broad grin. He patted me on the back so hard in a friendly gesture. Well, I'm glad to hear it, son. Well, I need to get going now, but it was very good meeting you, Howard. All the best. I hope you enjoy working here at the cemetery. We're very glad you've joined us. I watched Glenn climb into his Buick. He sounded his horn as he drove down the long driveway, through the large, gilded, highly stylized wrought-iron gates of the cemetery, until he was gone. And then quite suddenly I felt very much alone. The cemetery was ominously quiet, without a soul to be seen. But once I'd opened my car door and let Lacey out of my truck, my spirits immediately lifted. Thank God I had Lacey with me. I sensed it might get pretty lonely here at Green Ivy Cemetery, but with my dog around I could cope with almost anything. And if Lacey was anything, she was a great companion and very good company. Maybe that was why many of the previous caretakers had left their jobs here at Green Ivy Cemetery. It could get lonely out here, feel isolated and forsaken. And as Glenn had so eloquently pointed out to me, a few stray noises here and there, from one of the gnarled-looking boughs of the old oak tree to the rear of the property, recklessly banging or even tapping against the eaves of the caretaker's house, would more than lightly disquieten and confound anyone who was living on the grounds of the cemetery and was allowing a fertile imagination to spout all kinds of nonsensical suggestions in their heads. That could drive the most sane among us kicking and screaming from an unearthly place like this. I groaned as Lacey made a beeline for someone's granite tombstone. The name was Douglas Birdsong, born in 1932, died in 1999, with the inscription, "May his soul fly up on eagle's wings," engraved elegantly on the stone in an italic scroll. Lacey lifted her leg to relieve herself. She gave me a satisfied, "Ah, that's so much better," kind of look, then sniffed the gravestone to see whether her scent had improved its standing in the cemetery, and then she bounded towards me with a rambunctious enthusiasm, her tail wagging like a sail blowing at half-mast. I wonder how Douglas Birdsong would feel about the musk bouquet that had splashed itself against his gravestone. I didn't want to know. I was going to have to teach Lacey to be more discriminating about where she chose to lift up her leg. I could not have her putting her scent on all the grave markers. We both went into the house, and I returned with the long jangling set of keys. It was the largest, most elaborate stylized key that was used to lock the large wrought-iron gates at night of the cemetery. I observed the Mickey Mouse kitchen clock on the wall had already struck 4:30. I should have locked the gates half an hour ago. I efficiently attended to my duties, with Lacey bounding behind me with a frisky ebullience. She was very appreciative of the exercise, after having been cooped up in my car for so long. After locking up the ornate wrought-iron gates, I hurriedly returned to the little red brick building to settle down for the night, with only two things on my mind: food to line a famished belly, and a comfortable, cosy bed for the night. What more could a man ask for, especially one like me that was pretty much living hand to mouth, blowing the way the wind took them, and this was my new residence for the foreseeable future, if things panned out well for me, that is, and I really hoped they would. The little red brick caretaker's house was comfortable enough, with a lounge, kitchen, bedroom, janitor's office, storage room, and a spare bedroom. It was one hell of a lot better than hanging around creepy Kirsty and my mother, who at the best of times made the strangest, most idiosyncratic couple, and their company was less than agreeable. It was nice not to have to put up with my mother's disparaging tongue all the time. I couldn't believe how much trust I'd been given by Glenn and his cousin Chester in handling blank cheques and petty cash. Still, I was a trustworthy person, and maybe Chester the attorney had sensed that when he interviewed me on the phone, when he'd given me the job. Or maybe, because they were honest men, they naturally expected other men to live up to their high code of ethics. I was relieved to find that, just as Glenn had assured me, the freezer was fully stocked with pre-cooked frozen meals. They were all neatly labelled and looked as if they were home-cooked. I immediately flung the frozen food into the oven, removing its plastic packaging. I'd have to defrost it in there and cook it at the same time, I decided. I settled on 2 portions of beef stew with dumplings, one that I'd give to Lacey with some of her dog biscuits. That dog thought she was human anyway. Before long I sat down to eat my food in front of the television set in the lounge. The television was very old, the reception rather static, and the remote control so well used that the markers on them were mere suggestions, but somehow I managed to navigate my way through the various channels. The food was surprisingly delicious, and Lacey wholeheartedly agreed, as she continued to lick her bowl clean, long after the food had been devoured. It had been a long, exhausting day, and my bed was calling my name. I could barely keep my eyes open, so after I'd locked up for the night, I returned to bed and fell fast asleep, pretzeled between Lacey and a huge pillow. I am not sure what time it was, but I woke up with a start in the middle of the night. or the early hours of the morning. I couldn't be sure exactly. It was almost as if someone had flung cold water on my face. My room was swathed in a velvety black darkness, with the curtains drawn. It was so tenebrific that I could barely see my hands in front of my face. I had been awoken to this enigmatic, peculiar, loud banging sound. It was as if someone was thrashing two cast-iron pans together. This was no tree bough knocking against the eaves of the house, as Glenn had suggested. This was something very different. I don't think there was any wind blowing. Someone was out there. Lacey was looking up towards the window area of my bedroom and was growling, as if she sensed something was out there, but she wasn't assertive enough to bark. I fumbled around on my nightstand to reach for the switch to turn on the Tiffany bedside lamp, and I put it on. Thankfully, the soft, subdued light made the obscure dark shadows in my room more distinct. The banging began again. It sent chills down my spine, and the hairs at the back of my neck were standing on end. Someone was out there, and if they were pranksters, they were doing a good job in scaring me half to death, because scared I was. I had so carefully locked the gates of the cemetery at 4:30, but it was possible for teenagers to climb over those gates and play some scary games with me to get their kicks, especially if they'd learnt that there was a new caretaker at the cemetery. But this cemetery wasn't that close to town, so it was more than a little bizarre. That was when I heard the strange jabbering voices. Lacey began to shrink and recoil in the corner of the bedroom, like she did when there was a thunderstorm. She seemed scared. Someone was out there. I could hear the voices very clearly. I pressed my ears against the wall and heard this peculiar chatting, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, as if two people were having a spirited discussion about something. But they were speaking in a language that was so alien, so foreign to me. I don't believe I'd ever heard it before, but it seemed like they were engaged in a garrulous conversation and were standing directly outside my bedroom. I was too hesitant to pull the curtains back. I was afraid of what I would see. I mean, I'm familiar with Swedish, German, Japanese, Chinese, and even some African languages. But this I'd never heard before. The male voice boomed. Malinati kasalana kwalina tolamasi hitilaki ha kanakalana kolamashan sila kola pikalina tolo basikili. Homoki ha ilakila kwa hoso foshani kalaminatila vakilaso agila kwanasi angina mikolano to ha tila bikasi hokulati hakanakachakwa amikali no basila. I immediately gathered my nerves together with some reassuring self-talk and threw my dressing gown on over my pyjamas, tying its belt around my middle tightly, slipping my cold feet into my very old slippers. Then with my set of long jangling keys, I scurried to the front door, negotiating my way through the different keys. There were so many of them. It was hard to tell one from the other. One of them opened the front door, but which one? With trembling fingers I experimented with a plethora of keys, plunging them one by one into the keyhole to see if any of them fit. Then I hit pay dirt when I managed to turn one of the keys in the lock. The door swung open, with a sizable creak and groan. A cold blast of icy fresh air greeted my face, but as I glanced out at the night, nothing unusual grabbed my attention. Lacey followed me around the cemetery obediently, her nose pinned to the ground, her tail wagging furiously, as if she thought this midnight adventure was incredibly exciting. Her former angst seemed to have whittled away. That's dogs for you, quick to forget that only moments before they were cowering in a corner in fear. The mysterious voices had long since gone, and the only sounds I could hear were the trills of the frogs and the crickets. So armed with my powerful flashlight in my hand, and a rather surprising brazen boldness that I must have borrowed from someone, as it certainly did not belong to me, I guess I knew in my heart that if I was going to do this job well, I needed to conquer all my lingering reservations and self-doubts. I was working in a cemetery, for God's sake, and it was bound to inspire my nerves to become a little more sensitive than usual. I assertively walked around the fringes of the cemetery, my eyes adjusting to the gloomy light. I circumnavigated the red brick caretaker's house where I was staying, but nothing was there. I had this profound sense I was being watched. But as I glanced over the gravestones that plunged their heads obtrusively through the ground, like well-worn jagged teeth, I saw nothing. Only the soft caresses of moonlight brushing over the stones in a gossamer fusion. I also observed some ambiguous dark shadows moving through the trees that could have been anything if I chose to indulge my imagination. I was overcome with a strong sense of being watched, almost as if there were eyes everywhere, burning into the back of my head, and the pervasively discomposing feeling never left me for a moment. I studied the window outside my bedroom, where I'd heard the two voices, and in a small muddy patch outside my window, I observed a gargantuan-sized footprint. What the hell, I thought. I bent down to examine it closely with my torch. I'd never seen such a monstrously huge footprint before. It certainly proved that someone must have been outside my window. But who? Whoever they were, they had feet the size of a small animal, and that didn't make any sense at all. I hasten to say the next few days spent at Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery went by rather smoothly, without any hiccups to contend with, and the outlandish outer-worldly events that I'd experienced the first night I put down to being far too exhausted and overly fatigued. Maybe the voices I'd heard were part of a weird dream, but it certainly did not explain the idiosyncratic gargantuan footprint outside my bedroom window. That was real enough, and the feeling of being watched when I'd taken that brief stroll around the cemetery with Lacey at my side had been very spooky indeed. Suffice to say there were some advantages being young, as I was able to sort out some of the major problems around the cemetery that needed prompt attention. When I picked up some stuff at the hardware store, the manager stared at me through his brown, ferret-like eyes. "You're the new caretaker of Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery," he said, making a strange noise at the back of his throat. "Yes, I am," I admitted. "It's a bit of a lonely job, but at least it's money in the bank." "Well, rather you than me. I wouldn't work at a cemetery if you paid me big bucks. I've heard stories about that place over the years. Discomposing stories. People have seen things, strange phantom figures, stuff like that. But I'm sure you're acquainted with some of those stories. You've obviously got nerves of steel. I admire that in a man. You're younger than all the other caretakers. I hope it pans out for you. I rarely do. Most of the caretakers didn't last very long. But I hasten to say, it's tough getting those Raymond brothers to mow the lawns, weed around the graves. Oh, those three men are lazy. Nobody hires them around here. They're layabouts." He shook his head. "I hate laziness of any kind. It irks me greatly, and those young men have an Academy Award in it. Good luck with motivating them to lift a weed out of the ground." When the three Raymond brothers arrived at the cemetery for their maintenance job, I knew at once they were lazy. You could see it, in the reluctant, disinterested way they removed the trowels and gardening stuff from the yard shed, with the efficiency of a sloth, and the enthusiasm of someone on death row, being led to the chambers to receive the lethal injection. They smoked cigarettes tirelessly, stank to high heaven of cigarette smoke, and wore faded denim overalls, as well as fatigued expressions on their jaded, washed-out, somewhat bemused faces, that suggested that they intended to do the bare minimum. I left them to their own devices, after showing them what needed to be done. "These roses are in desperate need of pruning," I explained to them, when I pointed to the beds of roses around the cemetery. "I see you have not tended to them before. You do know how to prune roses, do you not?" I asked them gingerly. The men looked at me through glazed, almost stupefied eyes, and nodded briefly. It was hard to get them to speak at all. Two of the brothers, much like my mother, had gormless, gummy smiles, were missing most of their teeth, and those that remained were yellow and heavily stained from nicotine. I wondered if they'd been to school a day in their lives. They looked dumb, uneducated, illiterate, and almost inbred, as if they were the progeny of a sister who had married a brother. But I knew that was not the case. It was hard to believe that Chester, the attorney, dealing with the trustees of the cemetery, had a soft spot for the mother of these 3 young men, who were roughly my age, and looked as if they couldn't even string a sentence together, let alone mow a lawn or weed a bed. I ask you, how could a mother who was clearly very well educated and reasonably impressive have given birth to 3 sons who just seemed not to be very bright, like 3 fireflies missing their lights, not to put too fine a point on it? I walked around the cemetery showing the Raymond brothers what needed to be done, and one of the men, a young man calling himself Big Boy, probably because he fancied himself rotten, he certainly looked like he did when his chest puffed up, he began to chuckle at me. "You're the new caretaker." "That's right," I said. "I am the new caretaker." For some reason all 3 brothers began to laugh at my expense, showing me a full display of their goofy, toothless grins. "You won't stay long, like the others," they said. One of them made the sound of a ghost. "Ooh! Ooh!" And then they all laughed and shook their heads. Is that what I was to them? A laughing stock, I thought. I took no notice of their insinuations, as I knew I wasn't like all the other caretakers. I was not so easily scared off, even if I was living on a property surrounded by graves. During the course of the morning I went up to check on the 3 Raymond brothers to see how they were progressing, and I observed that 2 of them were snoozing, lying on the ground with their floppy heads propped up against the gravestones like pillows, and spittle running down their chins, in between heavy snores, while the youngest brother, who called himself Black Bear, was smoking cigarettes and languidly knocking back a can of beer. You've got to be kidding me. They were supposed to be working, and working hard. They weren't being paid to lounge around a graveyard like blubberous walruses on a beach. This was a joke. I became incensed with the 3 lackadaisical brothers. "If you don't get your butts into gear," I snapped, "you won't get paid this month. Do you understand? And I mean every word." My ominous warning words seemed to do the trick. They gave me beleaguered looks and snapped out of their dreamy oblivion. They began to steadily mow the lawns, weed around the tombstones, and prune the roses. It would seem they were not as incompetent or as clueless as they pretended to be. Perhaps acting stupid was part of their artful act, so people wouldn't ask them to do much. I knew in my heart that not for a very long time had the cemetery looked this good. I resigned myself to the sobering fact that every time the Raymond brothers arrived on site, I'd have to bully them to get their butts into gear, like a long-suffering ringmaster in a circus getting the reluctant bears to stand up on their hind legs while balancing on a beach ball. But I knew it could be done. I was not going to be reticent about giving them that much-needed push up the backside. Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind, and those Raymond brothers were their own worst enemies. Let's just say I knew if Glenn and his cousin Chester and the trustees of the cemetery could see it right now, I didn't doubt they would be heartily impressed. The cemetery was beginning to look halfway respectable. The run-down, rather shabby, uncared-for appearance of the grounds, that were shoddily tended to in the past by the slothful Raymond brothers, were a thing of the past. I had made sure of that. The roses had been neatly pruned, and the long grass that formed an untidy, tangled hedge around the sides of the gravestones had been superbly trimmed. Along with some of the hedgerows, it really did look good. It would seem threatening the Raymond brothers with no paychecks seemed to scare them into working, as the thought of no cigarettes or booze was not something they could happily entertain. I was hitting them in their wallets where it hurts, and it was working a treat. I'm quite sure they were viewing me as a tyrant, but did I care? Absolutely not. I was beginning to enjoy my job with its quirky challenges it presented me with. Little did I know things were going to get a whole lot quirkier, and not necessarily in a good way. But being a caretaker at a cemetery is not necessarily a colourless job, not like I was expecting it to be. I regularly picked up provisions from the nearest town, interacting with the locals there, who on learning that I was the new caretaker at Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery, could not resist dropping some rather inappropriate jokes about ghosts and ghoulies, none of which in any way served to intimidate me. But what was a botheration was the amount of people that told me I wouldn't last long at Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery, like the long line of caretakers before me. There was a small part of me that wanted to prove all the doubting Thomases wrong, and another part of me that knew I needed this job. Running away was not an option for me. Some of us are forced to weather the storms that come our way, endure the unexpected hurdles life might swing our way, through no choice of our own, as sometimes the luxury of choice is simply not available to us. During the day, Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery would occasionally get visitors, sometimes coming in twos or threes or even on their own, with flowers in their hands and tears in their eyes, even if a deceased person may have been gone for quite a time. I could sense some of us, no matter how many years since a loved one crossed over, never truly overcome our grief. We just learned to live with it, like I was learning to adjust to my new lifestyle. Lacey was getting used to life at the cemetery, as much like me. She had never enjoyed the company of creepy Kirsty or my mother, and was finally happy to have escaped a life under their roof. I hasten to say when my back was turned, Lacey was up to her old tricks. She couldn't resist peeing on some of the gravestones, an irresistible habit that she didn't seem to be able to overcome. Suffice to say, moving to a cemetery had not made my dog any more courageous, as you might expect. Nothing had changed in that regard. If she saw a squirrel, a chipmunk, or a rabbit bobbing around the cemetery, she'd run to me for refuge, with her tail between her legs, looking if she'd been pursued by a Herculean-sized predator, not something so tiny that she could personally have torn to shreds in seconds with her large jaws. As Glenn had informed me, there were a few funerals held at the Ivy Leaf Cemetery, but not terribly many. By all accounts, a grave would be dug a day or so in advance by the grave diggers, and 2 days later a funeral would progress, where mourners would descend over the gravesite, wearing black dresses, suits and hats, clad with tissues in their hands, wearing those lugubrious expressions on their faces, made worse by puffy eyes. I was walking around the graveyard, and I noticed a small gathering of people standing over a gravesite of a recently departed man. I'm not sure how many people there were there, but I guessed it was just immediate family. I watched the coffin being lowered into the ground, and the people throwing their flowers on top of the wooden box, but not one of those people were behaving sorrowfully, like traditional mourners would do when they're saying a sad farewell, as even the way they flung their flowers into the coffin was really revelatory. It would seem their indignant body language suggested that the dearly departed they were not sorry to see go. I was so intrigued by the obvious displays of contempt by family members around the gravesite that I was unable to stop staring at the scene, as if I was glued to a television program on the box that had grabbed my immediate attention. And that was when I noticed something even more absurd, and I didn't know how to make a rhyme or rhythm out of it. My attention had been drawn to the nearest large oak tree, close to the open grave. I'd seen an ambiguous figure, peeking clandestinely behind the tree, and watching the funeral procession. It happened a few times, and I wished I'd had some binoculars with me. Was I mistaken, I wondered? Was it a trick of the light? I could lie to myself as much as I like, to soothe away my trepidation, with the antiseptic ointment of denial. But I knew I'd seen something watching those mourners, and whatever it was not a bear. It was a human face I had observed, on something gargantuan in size, covered in hair, and this thing, whatever it was, appeared to be very interested in that whole ceremony. It was more than a little absurd. That night I sat back watching television. It was awfully annoying, as it kept jumping channels, and sometimes the screen would become bespeckled with black and white dots and make a hissing sound. This happened quite regularly to me. Other strange things happened from time to time in the caretaker's cottage, like the faucets in the bathroom sometimes coming on and off on their own accord, and kitchen cupboards being left open that I knew I'd closed. For most people that would have scared them rigid, but not me. I got used to it, although I don't mind admitting it was ever so slightly unsettling. The trouble is, if you focus too intently on strange things happening around you, it might completely rob you of your peace, and I couldn't allow that to happen to me under any circumstances, because I needed this job. Maybe there was a ghost inside the house, but it was probably harmless, and was nothing to fear, I told myself. Tell yourself that enough, and you may begin to believe it. It was after I'd enjoyed a couple of reheated frozen meals that me and Lacey returned to bed, as we always did. Before long I was awoken again to a complete repetition of my first night I'd spent at the cemetery. Something was banging the sides of the house very loudly, and the sounds of witches' fingernails seemed to be tapping at my glass pane. Oh my God, someone was out there, outside my window. Lacey was lying on my bed, her head cocked up, drawn towards the curtain, her lips curled back to expose her canine teeth. She began to emit a low growl. Her dark eyes were entirely focused on that curtain, and every hair on her back was standing up on end. My heart began to rattle around in my chest so loudly. Chills ran down my spine. I knew someone was out there. My worst fears were confirmed when I heard the chatter, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. Matila, agina, ola matila, ikati kwashonokota, inati, aginaso. Manilani, hatila mikitina to gadnati kalakwan sipa. The booming male voice was so commanding, so authoritative, so intimidating. "Who is there?" I cried out in a muted voice that gradually became more confidently assertive. "Who is there?" In a trice the voices suddenly stopped, and in a moment of brazen boldness I ran over to the bedroom window and pulled back the curtain as quickly as I could, and that was when I saw them. Under the soft moonlight, two very burly, Herculean creatures gliding away through the tombstones towards the trees. They were so human in their gait. My mouth dropped open, for I could not comprehend what it was that I'd seen. The next morning, after enjoying a breakfast of toast and coffee, I gathered my huge ring of jangling keys together to get ready to open the wrought iron gates of the cemetery for opening hours. I proceeded to open the front door of the caretaker's property, and it was then that I screamed. Trussed up on the porch, in an upright position, was a dead man, dressed in a black suit. Even before I studied the unmoving figure, I knew he was dead. He stank to high heaven of death and decay. There is no worse smell. There were maggots crawling all over him, especially in his ears and his half-open mouth, and some were dropping out of his nose, losing their balance and falling off the body onto the step below. I realized I was being watched and scrutinized. I looked up to find a couple of black crows perched on a gravestone not far from the property. They were eyeing the dead man like a vulture over a carcass. I guess they'd been feasting on the falling maggots. They were cawing as they eyed me through their dark, beady eyes. I believe in their eyes the body of the deceased was like a maggot vending machine. One tap on the body with a beak and the maggots would fall to the ground like a can of Coca-Cola when you pushed the money through the slot. They were welcome to the maggots. They were fat and ugly, wiggling all over the place. I'd never seen anything more grotesque in my entire life. I covered my nose in disgust, staring at the corpse in disbelief. Was this really happening to me? Was this someone's idea of a macabre, sick joke? If it was, I was not laughing. Had someone dug up this body from one of the graves in the cemetery, as this recently deceased corpse was certainly in the first stages of decomposition? The flesh clung to the face tightly, and was a waxy white colour, and the eye sockets were empty, as the eyes had already been devoured by the maggots, some which were still wiggling around furiously in the open orifices. I knew at once that someone had propped it up here on purpose, to scare me perhaps. But who in their right mind, when digging up a grave, would remove a body like this? Surely the Raymond brothers had not done this. I couldn't help wondering if they had, to get their back on me. But it seemed a crazy thing for them to do. I then remembered Glenn's ominous words about remains being pulled out of a grave. "Just put the body back into the grave," he had said, "so as not to cause the family distress. And phone me if you have any problems in that regard." He was kidding, right? I hadn't signed up for this. I immediately ran into the red-bricked house, slamming the door behind me. My legs and hands were trembling, my body a panic. I hurried into the janitor's office, grabbing the landline, and with fumbling fingers I managed to dial Glenn's number after several failed attempts, as my fingers had become like butter, and the phone was practically sliding in my hands like a slippery fish. I couldn't actually keep hold of it. Finally, Glenn's drowsy voice answered on the other end of the line. "Glenn speaking. Who is this?" "It's me, Glenn. Howard, the new caretaker at Green Ivy Cemetery. We have a little problem here. Well, actually, it's not so little. It's a big problem. Quite a big problem, actually." Glenn sighed on the other end of the phone. "What's happened?" "There's a dead body, propped up on the doorstep. It stinks to high heaven. It's covered in creepy crawlies. Glenn, this is a nightmare. What the hell am I supposed to do? Is this someone's idea of a sick joke? You don't think the Raymond brothers have done this, do you? To get their back on me?" Glenn was silent for a moment, and then he said, "It's happened before, Howard. And no, I don't believe it is the Raymond brothers. It's happened twice before, in the last couple of years. Was there a funeral service yesterday at the cemetery, by any chance?" "Yes, there was. But what has that got to do with a dead body on my doorstep?" "It was likely that this was the grave that was vandalized overnight. You need to call the Raymond brothers over to the cemetery to replace the corpse back into its casket and to rebury it in the ground. I'm afraid it is likely to keep happening, Howard. This problem needs to be handled with kid gloves, I'm afraid. We can't allow word of this to get out. It could be catastrophic for this business and make people less desirous to purchase a burial plot from us. So I'm sure you appreciate that the utmost discretion is required on your behalf." "What do you mean, keep happening? What do you mean by that?" "And right, too right. This is very bad for business. If word of this got out, you—" I know, Howard, but please don't panic. There is something out there in the cemetery, Howard. I'm not sure what it is. But a couple of occasions, he or she does not appear to like the deceased body that has been buried in the graveyard. And whoever they are, they make us aware of this by digging up the grave site, removing the body from the casket, and placing it on the doorstep of the caretaker's house. And they will repeat this nonsensical charade again and again until we pay attention to their message and relocate the body permanently to another cemetery. They don't want the body here for some reasons I cannot comprehend myself. The only way to resolve this situation is to get in touch with the bereaved and to make alternative arrangements for the body to be relocated and reburied in another cemetery. It's the best course of action under the circumstances. All this will keep happening, and you will be faced with the same dead body sitting on your doorstep every morning. And I'm sure you don't want that. You're going to have to be very diplomatic, Howard, when you phone up the bereaved. People can be very sensitive over issues like this. No one is going to be happy to think the remains of their beloved are being unearthed from the ground. Mind you, the two bodies that were unearthed in the past, well, let's just say, the bereaved wanted nothing to do with the deceased for reasons I have no idea. But there you go. That's human relationships for you, isn't it? Even beyond the grave. Complicated. What I'm saying, Howard, is you need to employ the utmost tact when contacting the bereaved. I'm sure you appreciate that. But I think you will handle things very well. You mean I've got to phone the bereaved? You're asking me to do this? Why me, Glenn? I'm only a caretaker. That's right, Howard. You're the caretaker. You manage the cemetery. If a grave has been vandalized, it's your job to sort the problem out. My job? I asked appalled. I have to sort out this mess? I'm afraid so, Howard. I know it's not the most pleasant job in the world. Too right it's not pleasant, Glenn. It's a nightmare. I think you will do fine, Howard. You've got a strong stomach. After a lengthy call with Glenn, where I argued pitifully with him about who was responsible for dealing with the deceased corpse, in the end I knew the job had fallen into my hands, and I would have to deal with the problem myself, whether I liked it or not. But one thing I would not do is to touch that dead body. I'd leave that for the Raymond brothers to do. They didn't seem to mind getting their hands dirty. I hurriedly scrambled over to the gravesite, where I'd seen the, let's just say, far from grief-stricken gathering of people, lowering the remains of the deceased into the ground. And as Glenn had predicted, this was indeed the vandalized grave. By all accounts, the sight that met my eyes was a sorry one indeed. The grave had been dug up with soil tossed unapologetically everywhere. The expensive oakwood coffin was lying toppled over on its side, with some of the pale blue upholstering ripped right out of it. For a long while I stood there rather bemused, not knowing quite what to make of this. It was the strangest, most bizarre thing I'd ever seen, but luckily it had happened only twice before. Otherwise the cemetery would be doing a measly business, with all the added expenditure it would take to get bodies relocated. Indeed, the 3 Raymond brothers, when they promptly arrived on site, affirmed to me that this enigmatic strange event had happened twice before, in the last couple of years. "Even if we bury the body here, it'll be dug up again in the morning," they assured me. "Something doesn't want it here." "Maybe it's one of the resident ghosts," said Big Boy, giving me a wide-eyed look. I knew at once, based on everything we were discussing, that I needed to phone up the relatives of the deceased and call the funeral home to get their contact number, which is exactly what I did, as well as making arrangements for the funeral home to pick up the body of the deceased and reorganize the transfer of the body and the digging of a brand new grave at another cemetery. I don't mind admitting I was nervous about making the phone call to the widow of the deceased. I was struggling to string the words together that would cause the least amount of distress to the bereaved family. My fingers were trembling anxiously as I finally phoned the deceased widow, a woman calling herself Grace Feeney. I was almost hoping she wouldn't answer the telephone as I drew in a great big deep breath, my heart crashing against the wall of my chest, while Lacey rested her great big head on my foot, as if to give me that encouraging reassurance that I really needed. "Yes, you can do this, Howard. I have full faith in you." It was as if she was saying that to me. The trouble was I didn't have much faith in myself, and at the very best of times I did not consider myself particularly good or diplomatic, or even very tactful when handling grossly disproportionate tricky situations. But I was the caretaker of the cemetery, and I needed to sort out this mess. "Hello," came the faint little voice at the end of the line. "Grace Feeney speaking. How may I help you?" Hello, Mrs. Feeney. My name is Howard Kesko. I'm the caretaker at the Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery, where I understand you laid your late husband to rest. Am I right? Yesterday afternoon, I believe it was." There was a stiff, uncongenial, rather cold silence on the other end of the telephone, and then the very beleaguered response, "Yes, that's right. What is this about?" "This is very hard to explain, Mrs. Feeney. It's just, well, how can I put it? Last night, someone dug up your husband's remains. His coffin was decimated." "What on earth are you talking about, young man? My husband is buried in the Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery, and you are saying someone has dug him up already? Is this someone's idea of a sick joke or something?" For a moment I thought Mrs. Feeney would hang up on me. Maybe she thought I was a prankster of some kind, who got the details of her husband's death from a recent obituary, and was getting my kicks out of upsetting a grieving widow. I mean, do you ever get people like that? I suppose you do, but I was not one of them. "Wait, Mrs. Feeney. Please don't hang up. I know this sounds incredibly bizarre, but this is no joke, Mrs. Feeney. This really did happen. Your husband's grave was decimated last night." "Well, what do you want me to do about this, Mr. Kesko? I assume the straightforward thing to do is to rebury my husband. Put him back where he belongs in the grave, surely. Why bother me with all this? Haven't I been through enough already? It's just this problem, Mrs. Feeney. Well, it's not going to go away. Believe me, if it was, I would not have contacted you. I would have dealt with this matter as discreetly as possible. Well, what do you mean, this problem isn't going to go away, Mr. Kesker? I don't quite understand what you're trying to say.
I have spoken to the attorney's brother, Mrs. Feeney. His name is Glenn. He's one of the men that manages and oversees the cemetery. I'm afraid a body being dug up from a grave has happened twice before in our cemetery, here at Green Ivy Leaf. Let's just say, Mrs. Feeney, based on past experience, we know that whoever is digging up the body, well, they will not stop until the body is relocated to another cemetery. We can make all the arrangements for you very discreetly, but we need your permission to do so. Our cemetery will cover all the added expenses.
Well, I should think so. I want nothing more to do with this matter, young man. Do what you like with that nasty bugger. Bury him at the Atlantic Ocean for all I care. But leave me alone, will you? That man was insufferable in life, and now he's insufferable in death, bugging me from beyond the grave. Won't he bloody ever leave me alone? It's so typical of him, this. Why am I not remotely surprised? I had an inkling that in some absurd way he'd haunt me from beyond the grave. And it turns out I wasn't wrong. What you are telling me is insane, preposterous. I've never heard of anything so outlandish before.
Look, Mrs. Feeney, I know you're upset, and this is an incredibly sensitive subject, and I apologize profusely for that. But I am going to need you to sign the consent forms to have your husband's remains relocated to another cemetery. I hope you can appreciate that.
Fair enough. I'll get my daughter Lucy to drop around to the cemetery and sign them on my behalf. But I'm going nowhere near the place. Do you understand that, young man? And please don't bother me any more with this matter. You must understand that the day my husband breathed his very last was actually the best day of my life, and I do not need him haunting me from beyond the grave. So do what you want with him, but don't ever bother me again. Do you understand?
Of course, Mrs. Feeney. And as I say, I'm incredibly sorry for your loss.
But before I could finish my sentence, Mrs. Feeney had slammed the phone down on me. I couldn't blame her, really. No one expects to receive a phone call like this. It was about 2 hours later when a beautiful young lady arrived at the cemetery. She stepped out of a roofless yellow Pontiac Firebird. She was about my age, roughly, with gloriously beguiling red hair and blue eyes. I don't mind admitting my heart jolted a little faster than usual. I had a thing for women with red hair. I couldn't help myself staring at her in wondrous awe. She was so lovely, with an emerald green dress that only seemed to highlight her fair skin and blue eyes. Luckily, Lacey offered a suitable distraction by eagerly bounding over to her, with her tail wagging. "Hello," said the young woman, who reached down to give Lacey a little pat, and then presented me with her hand. I took her hand in mine, and gave it a firm, friendly shake. "My name is Lucy Feeney. I'm here about signing those consent forms. My mother told me to speak to the caretaker, Howard."
"That's right, that would be me. Howard, although people who know me personally call me Hal."
The young woman looked a little startled. She let out a stifled laugh. "Sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, but you say you're the caretaker for this cemetery. But you're so young. I thought you'd be an old man that would run a place like this, if you don't mind my saying so."
"Well, you know how it is. I flunked college, needed a job, and this seemed like a good start for me."
"Really?" she said, raising a sceptical brow. "And you really don't mind working here? I'd feel so spooked living among the graves. I'm sorry to say that, but I really would. I'm not sure I'd be able to sleep at night. It'd give me the heebie-jeebies." "Have you seen any, you know?" she said, lowering her voice into a whisper. "Well, you know."
"Oh, you're talking about ghosts."
I finished her sentence, as she seemed reluctant to say it. almost as if the word ghost was a dirty word that should never be uttered in case it caused grievous offence.
Well, I've seen things around here I can't explain, heard things as well. Had the television going on the blink all the time, stuff like that. But no, I haven't actually seen an apparition, if that's what you mean, floating around the cemetery.
The woman seemed rather disappointed. Well, I always thought, if you were in a cemetery for long enough, you'd get to see things, if you know what I mean, supernatural things. She paused for a moment. Think about it. If you're a dead person and you're a ghost, it means you haven't crossed over to the other side because you've unfinished business here. Doesn't it stand to reason you'd hang around your body? I bet my father is hanging around his body. I can't imagine he'd want to cross over to the other side, knowing what he was like in life.
Why would you say that? I asked the woman, looking nonplussed.
Oh, things he was saying on his deathbed, My dad had lung cancer. Smoked 2 boxes of cigarettes a day, he did, and didn't even stop smoking on his deathbed. Can you believe that? Do you know, when he had a consultation with the cancer specialist, he was smoking in front of him? Who does that? I've never seen anything like it in my entire life. The sheer arrogance of it. That was my dad for you, full of absolute nonsense, never listened to anyone a day in his life. One of the most cantankerous, insufferable people you have ever met, causing many people grief in his life, most especially his immediate family, and most especially my mother, I have to say. But the less said about that, the better. Anyway, he told us he was afraid to die. He didn't want to go to hell. He told us he had done something really bad in his life, but he refused to tell us what it was. But let's just say it sounded pretty bad. I promise you, he hung on to his life so hard, until finally he didn't have any strength left. It's the first time I actually felt sorry for my father. He was a tortured soul, he was. He treated my mum so badly in life. She's so glad to see the back of him. It is kind of weird, isn't it? At the funeral yesterday, no one was sorry to see my dad go. And that's so tragic, if you think about it.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. But it sounds as if your father reaped what he sowed. If he chose to be so obnoxious in life, how could he expect anyone to grieve his loss? I really believe if we want to live our lives well, we should begin with the end in mind, so that when we do die, we know in some way we've left behind an indelible footprint, and that people will remember us warmly. But as for this hell malarkey, do you even believe hell is a real place? I asked her.
I'm not sure. The Bible certainly suggests it's a real place, doesn't it? It seems cruel for any human being to spend eternity being devoured by flames, does it not? Even if they were really disgusting in life. My dad, well, he was sure he was going there, with a first-class ticket. Anyway, enough about that dreadful subject. I don't fancy talking about hell. My mother told me I needed to sign some consent forms for my father's coffin to be reburied at another cemetery.
That's right. I'm very sorry that it's come to this, especially at such a sensitive moment in time for you. But the sooner you sign the forms, the problem will be out of your hair. Come this way, I said, leading her up the steps through the front door to the janitor's office.
This I certainly didn't expect, she said, shrugging her shoulders. To be back at the cemetery again. I was here yesterday, as you know, for Dad's funeral. He was a difficult man, as I told you, and now it appears he's been difficult in death. I understand from my mother someone is digging up his grave and doesn't want his burial place in the cemetery for some unfathomable reason. I've never heard anything so weird in my entire life. My father, well, he earned for himself lots of enemies in life. Maybe someone is doing this to him to get their revenge. My only concern is that this won't happen in the next cemetery, because if it does, my mother said we must get him cremated and be done with it.
I don't think you need to worry about that. What I can tell you, Miss Feeney, to give you a measure of reassurance, I do not believe an enemy of your father's in life is digging him up to extract revenge on him in death. Absolutely not. I think I can say this with confidence. You see, in the last couple of years, 2 other deceased bodies have been dug up here at Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery for inexplicable reasons by someone who has decided those bodies are not welcome in this cemetery. So we know that your father's grave will continue to be rudely disturbed, and his remains will be dragged up from the earth again and again until we relocate him. So I've made the arrangements for him to be reburied at another cemetery, with no expense to your family. But this event is unlikely to be repeated at another cemetery. I can assure you of that." The young woman signed the papers, and then she was gone as fast as a feather on the wind, and I wondered if I'd ever see her again. I certainly didn't have the courage to ask her out. I doubted she'd be interested in dating a caretaker of a cemetery. Imagine telling your girlfriends you were dating a man who made his living as a caretaker of a cemetery. I'm quite sure that would go down with her friends like a lead balloon. I was hardly a catch, although Lacey, my dog, would beg to differ. She believed she'd hit the jackpot when I came into her life. The arrangements had been made for the body of Mr. Feeney to be dug in a couple of days' time, and to be removed and relocated to a new cemetery by the funeral home. The cost would be covered by the trustees of the Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery. In the meantime, I had to try and make sure that whoever was responsible for digging up the body of Mr. Feeney would leave the gravesite alone for the next couple of days, or I'd be forced to call in the Raymond brothers to bury the body again until finally it was removed from the premises. I certainly didn't want to wake up in the morning to find the deceased body of Mr. Feeney perched up outside my front door, especially smelling as repugnant as he did. The putrid smell of death and decay is a smell you don't forget in a hurry. It stays with you. "You've got a dog, haven't you?" Glenn had asked me on the telephone. "Can't you leave her to guard the gravesite, to stop the perpetrator, whoever he is, from digging up the remains?" "I'm sorry, Glenn. Lacey's afraid of her own shadow. I think she'd be useless at guarding the grave," I told him. "Well, if Mr. Feeney is dug up again for 2 nights in a row, there isn't much we can do about it," said Glenn with a huge resigned sigh. "Never you mind. Do what you can. Maybe doing a few nightly patrols around the cemetery might scare the vandals off, or whoever has it in for that poor deceased man. Honestly, sometimes I wonder what the world's coming to," he said in exasperation. "Still, Howard, you're doing a sterling job. You should be proud of yourself. Keep up the good work, son." That night, after locking up the wrought iron gates of the cemetery, with Lacey at my side, I returned to the caretaker's property with a heavy, laboured heart. What if I had to wake up in the morning to find a deceased corpse, Mr. Feeney, perched on the doorstep again? The crows would be pleased to have their maggot vending machine still accessible to them, but my sensitive nose would not appreciate another minute of exposure to that god-awful smell, which had already caused me to throw up the contents of my stomach 3 times during the day. I decided that maybe Glenn was right. If I patrolled the premises regularly during the night, like a night watchman, I'd be able to prevent the vandal from disturbing Mr. Feeney's grave. It occurred to me that it might have been cheaper to hire a guard to stand over the grave during the night, to prevent it from being decimated. Had no one thought of that before? It had to be cheaper, surely, than paying the Raymond brothers to have to rebury the body twice over. I decided that a nightly patrol would not hurt. Yes, it was an inconvenience. It would ultimately mean I would be likely to be sleep-deprived for a couple of nights, but that could not be helped. A quilt of low-grey clouds hung across the dark sky, covering the moon and the stars in a foggy veil, so that the gossamer light of the Milky Way had lost its gay apparel, and was inauspiciously so much more faint. The dark sky was washed out and gloomy, with a bleak, dingy, but dense atmosphere that clung to me oppressively like the silken fibres of a spider web that you simply can't shake off. And this presumptuous wind had decided to trespass across the cemetery, with no consideration for me or Lacey's comfort whatsoever. I dressed up in my windbreaker and a pair of walking boots, as regularly every half hour we walked around the cemetery,
circumnavigating the grave of Mr. Feeney, like a pair of vultures greedily surveying a dead meaty corpse. Only in our case, this was one we still wanted to remain buried, but how long it would stay there, under the ground, was debatable. I think that Lacey thought her Christmases had come all at once. For a dog to get what could potentially be 15 walks in a single night, well, that was nothing to be sneezed at. And Lacey was bounding around the place like an excitable ebullient puppy, wondering whether her owner had suddenly become a demigod. The god of dog walks, so to speak. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when me and Lacey ventured out for our 12th walk of the evening. We had been doing our nightly patrols since 8 o'clock, and to say that I was wilting like an alpine flower in the meadow after a scorching hot day is not an understatement, because that's how I felt. The temperatures had rarely dipped, and there was a nasty cold bite to the air, and even with my windbreaker on, I needed to move speedily through the cemetery to keep myself warm. Lacey, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the cold temperature, but then again she was half St. Bernard, so this was her kind of weather. I was glad to see that the cloud cover had lifted, and the moon was now a bright yellow disk in the sky, casting her shimmering glaze over the cemetery, where her gentle caresses nudged the gravestones, inviting the cemetery to evoke a hauntingly airy mood that was so infectious it sent uncomfortable shivers down my spine, and a sense of foreboding overcame me. The gravestones, some large fancy granite crypts, others more humble in their stature, poked through the ground obtrusively, signing the atmosphere with their bleak, macabre signatures. The towering trees scattered liberally through the cemetery rattled their boughs like loose gnarled bones, and their leaves shook frantically, almost as if they could sense the ambience that had become significantly more inauspicious. I shook the weighted feelings of trepidation and disquiet aside, like the rain off a waterproof parka. I couldn't entertain them. I swear I could see ominous dark shadows dancing through the trees, and the feeling of being watched everywhere we went made my skin crawl. Me and Lacey navigated our way towards the burial plot of Mr. Feeney. It was a good thing that the grave marker had not been erected. Would that also have been decimated, I wondered? I was pondering over this very thought when I heard the voices. These were voices I was familiar with, the same voices I'd heard twice before, outside my bedroom window, in the caretaker's house, chatting away happily to each other. Maninaki anatta nakamolani sagilakwa hukota ilani omakatilo noko hakilatwanisa obaki aminasi ganakali nakolamata natswaki. That was when I saw the ambiguous silhouettes moving towards me, with the grace of the ocean waves rolling across the seashore. For they moved with such a coordinated rhythm, such a fluidity. At first they were but a mere suggestion of an outline. Then they became a big foggy blur of something black and dense, darker than the night, that was enormously big. My heart nearly flipped over in my chest like a tossed coin, and my blood felt as if it had been plunged into icy cold water. My legs began to twitch, as if they were persuading me to run. But my brain was not firing on all cylinders, so my inability to move had rendered me still, like a waxwork statue in Madame Tussauds. Lacey was not afraid, but very curious. She sat down next to me, her ears perked forwards, her eyes focused on the idiosyncratic approaching figures. The talking continued. Maninati, akinatola, bisikineta lenatola, aki, hakpolo, hakanikatuloa. The two creatures were oblivious to my presence, it would seem, but then they stopped quite suddenly, as if they realized they were not alone. I found myself staring at two enormous hair-covered human beings that were easily over 9 foot tall. One was female, the other definitely male. They possessed only a few primate influences that were seen in their overlong arms and pyramid-shaped heads. They both stared at me through wide eyes, while I began to tremble. I wanted to run away, I really did. but for some reason I just remained frozen to the spot. But my dog Lacey, who is normally afraid of her own shadow and terrified of even a squirrel, darted up to these two hairy beings as if they were her new best friends, and began pawing them excitedly. The female creature bent down to cuddle my dog, and that was when I saw the kindness in her dark eyes, and how much love she exhibited towards my dog. No one who loved animals like this could be remotely evil, I thought. The large male studied me and pointed to the grave of Mr. Feeney. To my amazement, his booming voice spoke directly to me. Surely he must appreciate that I could not comprehend a word of what he was saying. But then something quite extraordinary happened, that all these years later still perplexes me, as it has never happened to me since. The hairy man's words were immediately translated into my head in English, and suddenly, as if by magic, I understood every word he spoke to me.
Matina kilanikwa, o masikaniko, hilanasaki kalagwani, o manasalanika sakaliko kwasisana. Dark energy. Don't like it on my turf. It refuses to go away. I've tried to encourage the spirit of this man to cross over to the other side, but he refuses to leave his physical body. I'm afraid he is mulishly stubborn. His energy is ruining the ambience of this place. He needs to go. If he won't cross over to the other side and insists on staying with his body, then he must leave this place forthwith. I'm sorry to have had to dig his body up, but I needed you to understand that he must go. I pride myself on managing the affairs and ambience of my territory, and I don't appreciate spirits that refuse to cross into the light. Well, I have organized for him to be removed to another place in a couple of days' time. Do you mind awfully if you put up with his energy for a couple more days and leave him buried? I would appreciate if you'd do that.
The big hairy man considered my words, scratching his head thoughtfully, and began to engage in a lengthy discussion with the female.
Matila, imapo, anikanikwa, anola amisi.
Kita, akilakakua, silakinato. This time I didn't understand what they were saying, but it was looking good, as the female was nodding her head and looking at me with sympathetic eyes, as if she understood my plight. The male hairy man turned around to me to address me.
Alinatila o makisakwa, hilanatolo banasa. I think your request is reasonable, young man, in the circumstances. 2 days with the dark energy around, we can just about deal with. I've never encountered such a stubborn spirit before. This one refuses to move to the next realm. I must apologize for the mess I caused, unearthing his remains. But sometimes a man's got to do what a man's got to do. Dalinati maki kwanasa kinalono pasa itilanokwa.
The two hairy beings nodded at me, and then they glided away. At that time I had no idea what they were, but now I know they were Bigfoots. And for some reason they seemed quite fixated about energy, and did not like to accommodate dark energy on their turf. And Mr. Feeney was not a spirit they were willing to tolerate for some reason. I realized that these ambiguous creatures can see beyond the veil, and so who was I to query what they were doing, as they had a great understanding of things beyond my comprehension. I hasten to say the two hairy humanoids did leave the grave of Mr. Feeney well alone, until his body was finally removed, so they kept to their word. But when the funeral van came to retrieve his body, I was astonished to discover that the driver was no other than Tommy Ellis, the insufferable, pompous, conceited young boy who had moved to our hometown from Boston, and had wilfully tried to steal my best friend Neil Fleming from me, but I had warded him off by pretending my mother was a witch that would turn him into a toad. I was stunned to see him again. I thought he'd returned to Boston to complete a law degree. So what was he doing in Montana, driving a funeral van of all things.
"Tommy, it's me. Do you remember Howard Kesko from school? You tried to steal my best friend from me. Do you remember? Neil Fleming." "Oh, my word, it's you," said Tommy Ellis. "I'll be damned. How are you, Howard?" "I'm very well, thank you very much." "But what are you doing here in Montana? I thought you would be a big shot by now, a high-powered lawyer like your father."
Tommy flushed, his skin growing as red as a field of poppies.
"Oh, that. I did go to Boston, but I flunked my second year of college. I couldn't stomach that law degree. I've been working for my uncle's funeral home for the last few years. It's much more up my street, you know. I pretty much do everything for my uncle. I'm hoping to take over from him in a few years' time. What about you? What are you doing here, more to the point?" "Well, I also flunked college. My mum's not happy with me. I took up a job as a caretaker for this cemetery." "Is it true about your mother?" he asked me. "Last I heard she'd shacked up with a woman who has green hair and the mouth on her like a dirty sewer. Well, that's what I was told." "The rumours are true, I'm afraid," I told him. "I swear when I was a kid, your mother scared the living daylights out of me. I was convinced your mother was a witch." "Don't worry about that. Everybody felt the same way about my mother at the time." "I hasten to say, talking about wacko things," he said to me, "I've been to Green Ivy Leaf Cemetery to pick up a body from a grave 3 times, I have to tell you, that keeps being decimated. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen before. Whoever is doing this has got to be sick in the head. Imagine getting your kicks from digging up dead people from the ground. I ask you, haven't they got anything better to do with their time? It's Lucy Feeney I feel sorry for. I mean, the last thing her poor mother needs is her husband making a reappearance in her life. He was a nasty piece of work, let me tell you. Nasty, nasty man. Very, very ugly personality. Nobody liked him at all." "You know Lucy Feeney?" I asked him. "Yes, I do, as it happens. Very well. She's my fiancé's best friend." He studied me closely. "Oh, my word! You like her, don't you? I can see it in your face." He gave me a cocky grin. "Tell you what, buddy, why don't you come to a barbecue at my uncle's house? Lucy Feeney will be there." All that happened over 40 years ago. And believe it or not, I married the gorgeous girl with the red hair, whose father's grave was vandalized by a couple of Bigfoot. At the time I had no idea what the hairy men were, but I do know this, that their intentions were entirely good. My job as a caretaker branched out into a whole new business for me, where I now orchestrate the production of coffins, and the business has been thriving. And these days Tommy Ellis has become my very best friend. As for my mother, she's still shacked up with creepy Kirsty, who is as nasty as she was the first time I met her. But luckily these days her spiky hair is no longer dyed that luminous green colour, so some things are positive. My mother did come to my wedding, but we forever remain like water and oil. We just don't mix. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Pearl and I'm from the rich cultural evergreen state of Washington. I've lived here all my life, but the story that led to my incredulous encounter with the hairy man happened when my husband and I moved to the small picturesque town of Forks in 1994. The quaint little town is situated on the Olympic Peninsula, and we have amazing silvery rivers here, known for their abundance of steelhead and salmon, and to the east of our town is the Olympic National Park. We chose to settle in this idyllic part of the world because it's absolutely exquisite here, with a thriving, spirited community and a close-knit, warm, welcoming populace. We moved into a really spectacular green leafy neighbourhood here, where all the individualistic houses had been built relatively close together, with pristinely manicured front and back yards.
In truth, I think even the most mediocre of homes would find it incredibly difficult to look ugly here, surrounded by such sumptuous evergreen foliage. We moved into a whimsical, rather romantic craftsman-style home with a typical low-grey roof, wide eaves and triangular exposed beams, accentuated by thick round columns and a very sizable but attractive old-world stone porch. Our neighbourhood is heavily flanked by a vast area of dreamy natural forest made up primarily of spruce and Douglas firs trees, set up against the most panoramic views of undulating green valleys and the imposing hazy silhouettes of the mountains in the distance. One of the reasons we bought the house was because it possessed the most exquisite showpiece in the backyard, or pièce de résistance if you like, an archetype of note, shall I say, in the form of a quintessential koi pond that had been designed ingeniously by the previous owner. It would seem that no expense had been spared on the creation of this extraordinary conquest that had been executed with the finest attention to detail. It was overflowing with dozens of sizable, very beguiling large koi carp in the richest and brightest oranges that you've ever seen. Surprisingly enough, the koi were so friendly that when you put your fingers into the water, they would nibble you. I loved sliding my hands down their long, elongated bodies. This silvery gem was surrounded by sculptural rocky outcrops, and there were dreamy waterfalls that jetted white water down the rocky crevices into the rock pools below, and its crashing sound was so calming and relaxing. The rock pools were scattered with the most delicate ethereal pink and yellow flowing water lilies. On one side it was heavily fringed by clumping bamboo, and another with Bank of Canadas, which are an aquatic plant that help keep the pond clear by absorbing all the harmful nitrates in the water. This silvery expanse of shimmering water also possessed a very distinguishing feature, a purple bridge that brought out all the greens in the garden so magnificently. Then there were a couple of picturesque willow trees with very Junesque-shaped trunks swathed in carpets of luxuriant green moss and draping feathery leaves that hung over the water's edge. It was like a magical, enchanting sanctuary, and I even placed a whimsical statue of a large fairy in this perfect oasis, which might sound rather twee, but the whole area possessed that quintessential fairy tale fantastical feeling about it. I loved nothing more than chopping the vegetables for dinner and glancing out of my window towards the pond and watching the water cascading down the rocks. It was so beautiful to behold, and I would often just gasp because it would take my breath away. After living in Fork for over a year, I began to develop some close friendships with the locals in my neighbourhood, and we would often interact on social occasions with barbecues and drinks at sunset. One day I discovered that my next-door neighbour, a lady that I'm going to call Diane for the purposes of the story, had a secret up her sleeve that she wanted to reveal to me. I was promptly invited over to her house for tea to find out the source of this mystery. I remember she surreptitiously led me into the backyard, and I was in shock, for there before me stood a sizable pond that shone like a jewel in a crown. I was to learn that it had been customised for her specifically by a highly esteemed designer whom had won multiple awards for his outstanding showmanship in creating and engineering the most awe-inspiring ponds around North America. It was a triumph of note, and it was the epitome of the most enchanting magical pond that I'd ever discerned in all my life. I hasten to add that it far eclipsed mine in terms of its size and splendour. It was a tour de force to be reckoned. I was also bedazzled that something that was not even established at this stage could look this splendiferous, in its beginning stages, of course. I could only imagine what this tranquil oasis would look like in the years to come, once the plants around the pond became firmly established. I'd like to say that I was happy for my neighbour, but I'm sadly not that nice. I was more than a little green at the gills. I was also angry that she'd copied our pond, and I could sense that she was gloating that her pond was bigger and grander than mine. I began to feel like a petulant child, and when I returned home my husband asked me why I had such a long, discomposed face. "Diane's only gone and replicated our pond," I complained, "and hers is bigger and more stunning than ours." I could see she was conceited about it. You could see the smug look all over her face. I promise you she looked obsequious and pompous, just like a stuffed penguin, all puffed up and inflated by her own sense of self-importance. "Darling, there's no need to get so upset. We have a stunning koi pond, And if hers is bigger than ours, does it really matter? Yes, it does, I snapped. It really does. It makes me sick to my stomach, and even the plants she's chosen are identical to ours. Well, she must have been very impressed with our pond to copy us. They do say that copying someone is the biggest form of flattery. Well, of course she was boasting that she'd hired one of the top men in the business to design her pond, a man who's got so many awards. Can you believe that she had the gall to say, "I won't tell you how much it all cost"? But I discerned by the way that her mouth was twitching upwards that she was bursting to tell me. "What did you say?" asked my husband. I didn't say anything. I knew she wanted me to ask her the price, and so I just told her that her pond was very nice. My husband planted a kiss on my forehead. "You do look so cute when you're jealous," he chuckled. Fast forward a few weeks, and I was spending copious amounts of time relaxing by my pond. I just loved being out there. I loved watching my koi carp, and I loved just listening to the waterfall. But I soon discerned that my koi carp population had diminished and gone down significantly, and I was exceedingly puzzled about this peculiar sequence of events, so I sought some professional advice. I was told that maybe my fish were being attacked by birds of prey, and so I should put some pond netting on the surface, which I did, with what I must say was a great deal of regret, as it does spoil the look of the pond significantly. It was, however, necessary to protect my koi from predators. Yet despite my best efforts, I still began to observe my koi population going down quite dramatically. It was like one fish went missing a day. Once again I contacted the professional, whom suggested that possibly someone was stealing my fish. "It does happen," he told me. "Koi are in great demand these days, and the big ones don't come cheap." That was a light bulb moment for me, and with horrifying crystal-clear revelation, I knew at once who the mystery culprit was. Was it not enough that she had stolen my thunder by building an even more resplendent pond than my own? But now, to add insult to injury, she was actually stealing some of my koi. I was absolutely appalled and completely disgusted. I mean, how low could she sink? And so it was I surreptitiously played Diane a casual visit under the guise that I was popping over to say hello. "Oh, this is a lovely surprise," said Diane, opening her door to me. "I was going to come and see you. It's been a long while. I wondered where you've got to these days." "Well, I've been very busy," I snapped. "Would you like a coffee?" she asked. "That would be very nice," I said. "Do you mind if I look at how your pond is coming along?" "Be my guest," she said. I ventured out towards her beautiful glistening pond, and it was filled with copious amounts of bright orange carp. And I knew at once Diane had stolen well over 15 of my koi fish. I was certain of it. I recognised them, and I was as mad as hell. You could say that I was foaming at the mouth like a rabid dog. Not only had she tried to compete with trumping me with a grander, more majestic pond than mine, but now she had the audacity of pilfering some of my koi. I wasn't amused in the least, and I could feel the bile rising up at the back of my throat in total and utter disgust. How dare she, I thought. "You have a lot more fish than you used to have," I said, trying to sound as nonchalant as I could. "Oh, yes, isn't it wonderful? I was able to purchase them at a good price," she chuckled. "I bet," I thought. "Liar, big fat liar," I thought inside my head. When I returned home from Diane, my husband asked me why my face was so long and downcast. "You look like a dog that had his eye on the fillet steak and ended up with a dry crust of bread instead," he said. "I think this Diane woman rubs you up the wrong way. Every time you visit her, your face transforms itself into a stormy thundercloud. What on earth has she done now? What's wrong?" "Diane has only been stealing our koi carp," I told him, my face growing crimson with rage. "Who does she think she is? She's stolen 15 of our big boys." "Are you sure about this?" asked my husband. "Of course I'm sure," I told him. "I'd recognise my fish anywhere." "Well, sweetheart, if that is true, you leave it all well alone. This is a very small town. We don't want to stir up trouble here and create a stink. We have to live next door to these people. The last thing we need is to have squabbles and bad relations with our neighbours. You are just going to have to bite the bullet and pretend it never happened. That's what you do in these situations. But I want my fish back, I protested. Don't do anything stupid, my dear, my husband warned me. Believe me, it's not worth the bother. We can buy more fish, but we're unlikely to get new neighbours, and we don't want to fall out with them, do we? I do remember that night not having a good night's sleep. I was tossing and turning in my bed, and I was sweating profusely. I knew with certainty that I had to get my fish back. Diane wasn't going to get away with this, I thought to myself angrily. No way. I didn't care what my husband thought, nor did I heed his warnings, because they had fallen on deaf ears. I had other ideas in mind, and a plan was already forming in my head. I lay back in my bed, visualising Diana's gleeful face as she stealthily sneaked into my garden with a very large net in her hand, an oversized fish bucket. In my dream, I could clearly see the broad grin on her face getting wider and wider and wider as she began to steal my koi one by one and place them in her pond. Several times during the night, I felt I had to get up. I wanted to be sick and throw up. That was how ill I felt about it all. The following day, I had my binoculars pinned on my neighbour's house, and when Diane and her husband left for a shopping trip, I quickly sneaked out of my house with a large net and an oversized bucket in my hand, only to bump into one of my nosy neighbours up the road, walking his 2 French bulldogs up the street. How annoying was that? "What are you doing with that big bucket?" he said, looking at me with a curious interest. "Nothing," I lied. "I thought I'd wash down some windows." The gentleman looked at my net, and then at my bucket, with a cynical look upon his face, and then, shaking his head, he meandered on his way, glancing back at me a couple of times, but I was not going to allow some pompous upstart to impede my mission in any way. I knew going to my neighbour's pond in the middle of the day was a risky business, but so powerful and overwhelming was this urge to get my fish back that I was totally beyond caring. Before long, I began sneaking into her backyard. I must admit I did feel like a burglar, and I began my mission. Let me assure you that this was not an easy job. It was very difficult to discern which fish were actually mine, so I just settled for any vibrant, attractive, good-looking fish that were similar. The bucket weighed a ton, and the water kept splashing out of my bucket. Before long, I managed to retrieve 10 of my fish, but decided to call it a day as I was utterly exhausted. The very next day, I once again continued with my retrieval project until my fish had all been happily returned to my pond, and the relief I felt was monumental. I have to confess I felt a sense of rising euphoria and triumph that I had finally outsmarted Diane. That would show her up for stealing my fish in the first place, I thought. The following day I received a visit from Diane and invited her in for a cup of coffee. I won't deny that my heart was thumping in my chest a little faster than usual because I sensed that she was on to me. But then why should I even care? I'd only retrieved what was rightfully mine. Why should I feel remotely guilty? "I was just wondering," she asked me, "if by any chance you've had any of your Hoi Carp gone missing from your pond over the last couple of days. It would seem that 15 of my fish have just vanished into thin air." I tried to keep my expression very straight and stiff. "No," I said. "I have all my fish. You know what you should do? You should invest in a pond net. Perhaps you have a bird of prey attacking your fish." "I think it might be a very big bird of prey," said Diane sarcastically, giving me a calculated, willful look. One day as I was chopping vegetables in my kitchen, I suddenly saw something standing in my pond. I was stunned, and my first thought was that I was looking at a bear. I reached for my binoculars to have a better look at the critter. I nearly dropped them in astonishment, as I wasn't staring at a bear, but something very hefty that looked rather like a humanoid ape. It was covered in long, flowing, dark brown hair, and it had overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head that flowed into the shoulders in a seamless sweep. I observed the critter had a deep tanned-coloured face with a prominent brow ridge and deep-set dark eyes and a very flat nose, and also a wide but very thin mouth. What was it, I wondered in horror, for never in all my born days had I observed such a strange and curious beast. All of a sudden the critter plunged his big hands into the water and pulled out one of my big Hoi Carp that was wiggling frantically. He thumped the fish hard against the side of my pond and began to eat it like you and I would eat a banana, although he ate the skin as well. I watched in absolute horror as this dreadful scene unfolded before my very eyes, and then once satisfied, the critter leapt out of the pond with the agility of a frog. He glided away into the wooded area that flanked our properties on his powerful long legs, in 5-foot strides, with a grace and fluidity that was literally mesmerizing. For a moment I stood still, frozen to the spot, transfixed like a statue. Was it possible I could have imagined that, I thought? No! I knew what I was seeing was dauntingly real. I began to tremble and wobble like a jelly, as the after-effects of my disturbing visual experience unsettled me greatly. For indeed this creature was easily over 7 foot tall and 600 pounds, and was built with power, girth and strength of any imposing predator, much like a rhino or an elephant. I began to make myself a cup of coffee, while I piled copious amounts of sugar in it, without even realizing it, to calm myself down, for my nerves were frazzled. It suddenly occurred to me with horrifying revelation that the perpetrator of my missing Hoi Carp was no other than this hairy humanoid, who had obviously been eating them all. I had been stealing Diane's Hoi Carp in broad daylight, like a blatant in-your-face criminal, and they'd never been mine to take. Diane was innocent, and now I was the thief, and sneakily suspected that she knew that as well. Had she not said to me that the bird of prey must be very big? Was she referring to me? Now I really felt sick to my stomach, and incredibly embarrassed. How could I have got it all so wrong? The next day I decided to take a walk into the sylvan that bordered and fringed the outer perimeters of the properties in our street, from whence the critter had retreated the previous day. I noted a trail of very oversized footprints in the moist ground that I knew belonged to the critter, which I discreetly began to follow, not really even considering that I could potentially be walking into a viper's nest or the devil's lair. For indeed the creature I had observed from my kitchen window was not to be trifled with. Yet I was overcome with a heightened sense of curiosity. The sylvan is almost celestial in its transcendental magnificence, for it is like a world within a world, a sanctuary and oasis of resplendent rich greens. Its dreamy forest canopy embodies a dainty parasol that allows the prettiest shafts of sunlight to flicker through the branches, bathing the floor in dappled prisms of light, creating a sparkling ethereal magic that is indescribable. As I began to walk, the pretty bird song was not lost to my ears, and the brief sightings of songbirds and squirrels brought a smile to my face. Yet my mind was on one mission alone, and it was to uncover the mystery behind the critter that was pilfering my koi. All of a sudden things began to change in the forest, and everything became inauspicious and deathly quiet. So quiet, in fact, that it became menacingly mendacious, disturbingly so. I'd always been informed by my father that when sounds of the forest turn off like a light switch, you can be certain of one thing, and that is that a predator is in your midst. I stood very still for a moment, hardly daring to draw breath, as I discerned that the critter I had observed could indeed be close by. This was almost certainly confirmed by the cocktail of pungent odours that perforated my nostrils with a stench that is unlike anything I have ever smelt in my life. It rather reminded me of a skunk. That was when I heard a man's yelling voice. I crept cautiously ever closer and hid behind a large spruce tree. I was not prepared for what I was about to see. I recognised the man, for he was the homeless vagrant that I sometimes saw begging in the town outside the local bakery. He wore layers of dishevelled clothes that hung off his body in limp rags. I could tell the intoxicated man was pixelated, as his tipsy body swayed precariously like a tree being blown in a heavy wind, and in one wobbly hand he held a bottle of vodka, most of which was drained. The last remnants which he kept pouring down his gullet in large, frantic swigs. Why had he screamed, I wondered? Was it because he was off his head in a drunken stupor, or had something frightened him? The sloshed vagrant cried out again, and I realised it was because he was staring at a huge, hairy humanoid, much like the one I had seen languishing in my pond the day prior. Yet this critter was different. He was infinitely more foreboding and menacing, and was unlike anything that I've ever beheld in my entire life. He looked like the devil himself. I began to tremble and shake as my body lost its ability to control its impulses. I also wanted to scream out in terror, but my vocal cords seemed to be locked. I could taste the bitter nausea rising up in the back of my throat. I longed to turn around and just run away, but I was incapacitated by the sheer horror of what I was witnessing. It was as if my life flashed before me in a series of photographs as I watched this hideous, duplicitous scene unfold before my very eyes. It seemed like a lifetime, but in reality it was possibly only a few seconds or minutes at the very most. Yet in the fabric of our time, it seemed to last forever. This hostile, capricious critter, whatever in God's name it was, had an evil, demonical, portentous glint in his dark, malevolent eyes that twinkled with a hideously reddish hue. He stood yards away from the man, leering at him savagely, and his mouth curled back to reveal a large set of oversized human-like teeth. He began to growl, easily eclipsing the roar of a lion, for the ground reverberated under the sound. The inebriated, bladdered vagrant stared at the critter with glazed eyes and seemed transfixed. I think he may have believed the alcohol he'd been drinking was having hallucinatory effects on him, for he looked stunned, almost as if he was certain he must be dreaming. I couldn't blame him for that, for the critter seemed so surreal, almost as if he had walked out of the pages of your darkest, most terrifying nightmares into our reality. Yet I knew without a doubt that this critter was as real as you and I are. "Go away! Go away!" slurred the drunken man, waving his arms around as if he was wishing away his illusory nightmare. "Go away!" I watched him staggering around and slurring on his inaudible words. "Now, you go away," he said, waving his bottle precariously. "You go away. Now you go away. Go away. Go away." Once again the critter growled, and then he lunged forward and seized the vagrant into his oversized hands like a rag doll and whirled the man in the air, tossing him up and down like a pancake. The man was still screaming, "Go away! Go away!" The critter seemed to enjoy the sport of scaring his victim half to death, and then finally he threw the man on the ground with an almighty thump, and the man let out the most painful grunts, for he was still alive and slurring. "Oh! Oh! Ooh!" This monstrous beast grabbed his neck and twisted it to the other side of his head, and I could hear that final click, and I knew it was all over, for the vagrant at least. I stood behind the spruce tree, hardly daring to draw breath, for indeed I was afraid that the very sound of my breathing, or even the drumming of my heart, would alert the critter to my presence. But I'm pleased to say he was oblivious to me. I knew that I needed to stay as still as I possibly could, because running off was not an option for me. Even my legs felt as heavy as bricks of cement, and my heart was in my mouth. I also knew if the critter saw me or heard me, I was dead. The critter was breathing heavily and sounded like a horse. He began to kick the dead body like a football, as if even in death the man offended and appalled and repulsed him. He had no respect for the human form, for in some way it offended him greatly. I watched in horror as he ripped off one of the man's arms like you and I would tear a chicken drumstick off a cooked chicken. He then glided over to the tree trunk and sat upright with his torso propped up against the tree, and his powerful legs spread out in front of him. He began to eat the arm, and he gobbled it up until all the bones were stripped clean. He then went over to the corpse and gouged out the eyeballs from the sockets, as if they were delectable cocktail olives, and popped them into his mouth and ate them with great gusto. He did the same for the tongue. Finally the critter threw the body over a tree trunk much like a sack of potatoes, where it dangled precariously from the branches like a white mannequin with open sockets. He then left it there and glided into the forest and was gone from my sight, permeating the air with a hideous stench. It took me a long while to compose myself after the critter finally left, and trembling I went over to a bush and vomited violently. How I managed to manoeuvre my body after that through the Sylvan back home, I don't even know, but I managed to get there. My husband describes me as being in a very strange, catatonic, contrived state when I returned home. He said that I was so dazed that I was spaced out and didn't say a thing for many hours. He sensed that I was clearly shocked by something and waited patiently for me to come out of my abstract delirium. Eventually my husband gave me a couple of shots of brandy, which I downed very gratefully. I then informed him what I'd witnessed in the Sylvan, and he listened intently, but I knew he didn't believe that I'd seen an ape-like humanoid. He kept telling me that I must have been mistaken, and it must have been a bear, which was exceedingly frustrating, for I knew what I saw. It was no bear, I insisted. It was a giant humanoid ape that was 9 foot tall and 900 pounds, with evil eyes and long shaggy hair. My words fell on deaf ears as my husband informed the sheriff that I had seen the local homeless vagrant killed by a bear in the Sylvan. When the police searched the area, there was no sign of the vagrant, whom had seemingly vanished into thin air, but they did find blood on the tree that I'd pointed out. Rumours abounded and circulated around our town that the local vagrant had been mauled and killed by a bear, but his body was never found nor recovered. It was only many years later that I was to discover that the creatures that I had witnessed were Bigfoots. It was very strange that the smaller Bigfoot that had been pilfering koi from my pond never returned. He didn't strike me as evil like the critter that I observed killing the vagrant. If that was the case, I would never have followed those footsteps into the Sylvan. I have a gnawing feeling in my gut that he also was brutally murdered by that ghastly Bigfoot. I was informed by a friend of mine in the town that Diane had a trail camera installed near her pond, and she actually had footage of me creeping to her pond and hauling out her Hoi Carp and pinching them. She said she'd seen the footage of me furtively looking around like a real criminal. My friend told me that Diane thought that I was so jealous of her pond that I wanted to steal her Hoi Carp. I hasten to say that I just could not confess to Diane what I had done or why I had done it, because I was so embarrassed and humiliated, indeed so much so that I never even told my husband what I did. I couldn't bear the humiliation of him saying, "I told you so, I told you not to interfere." So even these days, wherever I see Diane, I tend to give her a wide berth, and she always looks at me with a look of, "I know what you did." So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Wayne, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1998, when I was 18 years old. I grew up as an only child raised by my single mother in a humble, modest area of Seattle, where we resided in a tiny, respectable suburban dwelling that was the most dilapidated residence in the entire street. Put it this way, it was much more in need of some TLC to put it back into pristine shape. My mother was incredibly embarrassed by the appearance of our meagre home, as we had peeling paint everywhere on the exterior walls and a leaking roof. She would tell me that houses were exactly like people, and when they grew older they needed the help of a very good plastic surgeon to creatively put them back together again. She assured me that plastic surgeons were very expensive to come by, so some houses were literally forced to age disgracefully through no fault of their own. I remember thinking that our poor little lowly house was like little Humpty Dumpty that could not be put back together again, and it made me very, very sad. My mother worked so incredibly hard as a dental hygienist to cover all our bills, but it was never easy for her as a single parent. My father had died when I was only 5 years old of pancreatic cancer. I had no memory of him whatsoever. My mother must have loved him terribly, because she always had his picture on her nightstand, and she would relentlessly read all the piles of love letters he had written to her over the years. I knew she must have adored him so much, because I would always see her wiping away the tears after she had studied a picture of him. Growing up, she had absolutely no interest in dating whatsoever, as her priority was literally focused on raising me. In truth, she was a phenomenal mother with the biggest, most generous and loving heart. One day when I was only a little boy whom had just finished my first year at a local school in the area, I was standing in line to speak to Father Christmas at a local department store in Seattle. I couldn't wait, but I remember I got pinched on my back by a very mischievous-looking boy who was called Peter, and he was giggling so much. So I started trying to pinch him back, and then I had to chase him all around the department store while our parents were keeping our places in the queue. Before long, Peter and I became firm, best friends. We were quite literally like brothers, and were inseparable. I remember spending copious amounts of time at his opulent, prestigious mansion in Seattle, where literally no expense had been spared. The grand palatial-looking mansion rather reminded me of the White House in Washington, and even my mother remarked of the stark similarity in appearance. It was not long before Peter's father literally begged my mother to pay for my school fees and all my expenses required for me to go to some ostentatious private school with his son. He told my mother that Peter was his only son, and that I was the nearest thing to a brother to him, and it would be an absolute privilege to pay for my school fees. My mother thought all her Christmases had come at once, because she'd always dreamed of sending me to a phenomenal school with an awesome reputation like this one had. So you can imagine we were thrilled. At school, Pete and I became as thick as thieves, and people often believed we were non-identical twins because we were so close. While all this was happening, my mother's house was falling apart at the seams, and she was getting some verbal abuse and intensive remarks from really nasty neighbours, who told her that her house was shrinking the value of the homes in the area and ruining the look of the entire streets. I remember telling Peter about the abuse that my mother was receiving from some of the stinging neighbours who were not slow in coming forward in expressing their disapprobation. If you cannot afford the repairs to your home, sell up and buy a smaller place. You're ruining the look of our street with your run-down-looking shack. When I told Peter the sad story about the incessant abuse my mother was receiving from her neighbours, I kid you not, within a day or so, his generous father stepped in and gallantly completely renovated our home by transforming it from the lowliest dwelling in our street to quite literally the most glamorous opulent home, with luxurious finishes and fittings. In truth, it really was way too prestigious a home for our area. But who was complaining? I wasn't. My mother told me that the neighbours who'd previously snubbed her were now inviting her to all their parties. Isn't that typical? I remember her telling me that some people falsely believed that the more money you had, the greater value and worth you had as a human being, which was a very ugly big lie, because some of the most beautiful, unassuming people in the world, and the most honest and reliable, were poor, and I was to never ever forget that. To this day, I still emphatically believe that money can never define who we are as individuals, or our authentic worth and value as human beings on this planet. One day when I was 18 years old, Peter invited me to stay at his uncle's very prestigious hunting estate here in North America. We were not staying at his estate during the hunting season, even though, of course, even off-season, they still did have guests. As you can imagine, Peter and I were so excited and over the moon to get this invite, but I would like to keep the location of where this hunting estate actually was located very, very secret, if you don't mind, for the protection of the estate itself and the Bigfoot I was ultimately to encounter, because all these years later there are still frequent reports of Bigfoot sightings on the estate, and I would not want to contribute to invading their privacy. When Pete and I arrived at the hunting estate for a 2-week vacation, even his uncle said he could hardly tell us apart. "My word," he said, "it is true. Your father was absolutely right. You both look like twins." The weird thing was that we actually did, in a strange way, as peculiar as that may sound, although I have heard it said before that you do become like the company you keep. We both had black wavy hair, olive skin, blue eyes, and were just under 6 foot tall, and were quite lanky. Peter's uncle was an amazing man, and he actively encouraged us to really enjoy the facilities on his hunting estate, which we most certainly took full advantage of. We were riding quad bikes, mountain bikes, playing golf, fishing at the lake, horse riding, swimming, and exploring the beautiful, well-maintained forests that were full of large oak trees, firs, spruces and maples, and were teeming with an abundance of indigenous wildlife, and some of the deers were the most sizable specimens with the largest, most impressive antlers that I have ever seen in my life. I could truly see why this hunting estate was booked up every year by eager hunters from all over the globe who wanted to enjoy their hand at some hunting. The estate offered luxurious accommodation, including individual cabins, very delicious homely food, and all kinds of other outdoor pursuits, and it was located in an exquisite location surrounded by panoramic views of rolling emerald green hills, mountainous valleys, rugged rocky outcrops, and imposing statuesque waterfalls, meandering pebbly streams with imposing rock-like formations, and of course a very large silvery lake that was a haven for bird life from fish eagles to the wild duck. Pete and I were sharing a small, whimsical, rather enchanting and lavishly decorated little Swiss-style music box wooden cabin that was flanked by a large wooded area. I remember I was woken up suddenly one morning at about 4 a.m. to the sounds of very definite gunshots. I immediately started to shake Peter vigorously. "Get up," I said, "get up! I think there's a poacher on your uncle's land. It's not even hunting season. Someone is illegally shooting. Get up, Peter, get up!" But Peter was a very deep sleeper and grumbled, telling me, "It's probably nothing, and get back to sleep." I was still in my pyjamas and was about to return to bed when I heard some more ominous gunshots. Something was clearly going on, I thought, and I needed to get to the bottom of it now. This time I was wide awake and fully alert. I quickly put on some shoes and, armed with my rifle and flashlight, I bolted out of the cabin as fast as I possibly could. Suddenly I saw him. There was a man running out of the woods that I was in no doubt was a poacher. He was up to no good. There was something distinctly shifty and duplicitous about this slippery character. He was holding his rifle and looking back towards the woods very, very furtively, almost as if he was half expecting to be pounced on by a predator who was in pursuit of him. It was that kind of concerned look. "Excuse me, sir," I said. "This is private land. What on earth are you doing here?" The young man scowled at me. He was dressed in a scruffy red t-shirt and jeans, and he looked at me with a guilty, sheepish expression written all over his face, and I knew unequivocally that he had just done something heinously evil, but I couldn't imagine what. I just sensed it and felt it in my gut. "What have you done?" I asked him. "What on earth have you done?" Then I heard it, the most terrifying scream, such of the likes that I have never heard before in my life. It truly sounded like a woman was being murdered. It was that piercing that even my chest vibrated under the sound. It was just terrifying. It was the most god-awful sound that I have ever heard. "What the hell have you done?" I shrieked. "Have you just murdered someone?" I screamed. "Your wife, perhaps, or some poor girl?" The man looked at me with a look of terror on his face, as if he was guilty as hell, as if he'd been caught red-handed, and suddenly he just bolted off as fast as you can imagine. In that moment I imagined this insidiously wicked and evil man had literally dragged a woman into the woods and murdered her in cold blood. There was no doubt that he was up to something. Did I chase after him and catch him, or go after the woman who may well be dead by now, the woman that had been screaming? I knew instinctively that there was a small chance that she could still be fighting for her life. Then I heard the horrifying scream all over again. A woman I now knew was in very definite serious distress, so I charged into the woods as fast as I could, searching for the anguished woman. There she was, squatting under a large oak tree, and she was lamenting, wailing and screaming as if she was in agonizing, inconsolable pain, and I could see why, because she was squatting over the dead body of a deceased loved one, and she was in a terrible, frantic state. I could sense and feel her agonizing, dreadful pain. I watched in absolute horror as she tried to shake the body, as if she was trying to bring it back to life, but it was completely useless because the body was very definitely dead, and it was not coming back to life. I just stood there in utter awe, watching this very tragic scene unfold before my very eyes, and tears of sorrow were pouring down my face. This woman who was grieving and pining so desperately was a colossal creature of about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and 4 feet wide. And yet, even though she was not human, she had such a human quality to her that was completely undeniable. I noticed she had very long arms, and that she was exceedingly muscular, with an enviable athletic body, that it was impressively strong, lofty, and majestic. For a moment I stood still, not knowing what to do. But then, on a burst of irrational emotional impulsiveness, I rushed towards this ape-like humanoid and cradled her in my arms, without any concern for my safety whatsoever. In that moment I didn't care about my own vulnerability, because my desire to comfort her far exceeded and outweighed any fear that I actually felt towards this creature. I think sensing and feeling this female's raw pain and desperate suffering was utterly intolerable for me to just stand and watch, and I simply had to reassure her in some way. I had to relieve her of the tortured distress and insurmountable grief that she was feeling. The joke was I was so small and pathetically puny in contrast to this colossal creature that I could not even wrap my arms around her gargantuan form. However, that was not even remotely significant, because she responded warmly to my touch, and even ran her large hands through my hair, ruffling it up affectionately with her sausage-sized fingers, so that it stood up in spikes. I believe that this was an expression of affectionate appreciation for me. I do remember I could hear her heart pounding through her hairy chest, and even feel her soft breasts against my body, because I was that close to her. She was whimpering exactly like a dog that's distressed, and was patting my back with her big hands, and I could feel that she was so comforted and reassured by my presence. I knew that my physical touch had been exactly what she needed right now, and I had succeeded in comforting her. I was so grateful for that. I did not want her to be alone in her grief, and I had no idea if she had any other family member who might be there to help her in this grievous time. I certainly hoped that she did, because I couldn't bear to think of her alone in her suffering. After a while I pulled away, and she looked at me with her big, sad, rusty-coloured eyes, and pointed very, very sadly to the dead body that lay on the ground. I examined the brawny, sinewy, hefty body, and discovered some gunshots on its head, chest, and shoulders. There were so many, it was unbelievable. My fingers were now covered in blood from my inspection. I realized that this poor creature had not stood a chance, and had been assaulted by bullets and killed by the poacher in the woods that had run away so furtively and so hastily. The hairy humanoid chattered away to me in a language that I couldn't understand, that sounded remarkably like gibberish, and then she physically acted out to me what had happened by miming the man with the gun, whom on seeing the male creature had clearly just fired several rounds at the critter without discrimination. The dead hairy humanoid was titanic in size, and was easily over 1,000 pounds, and yes, he was scary, he was intimidating and terrifying to look at, but that didn't excuse being assaulted at with so many bullets. However, from what the creature communicated to me, this large ape-like humanoid had done nothing to deserve being killed like this, because he hadn't imposed any threat whatsoever, and had intended the man no harm. He had only been interested and curious in the human, and had been peeking at him from behind a tree, and had accidentally been spotted by the sharp beady eyes of the poacher, who had run after him, shooting aggressively for many, many rounds. In my book, this creature was so human-like, it was equivalent to being murdered, and I began to feel this enraged anger and fury towards the poacher rising up in the back of my throat like a huge wave of nausea. I really wanted to puke in absolute disgust, as this man should not have killed this creature in cold blood like this, and clearly this was not a case of self-defence. I watched the very distressed, stoic creature digging away the ground with her very large hands, using a large stone to remove the soil, which by all appearances was exceedingly hard to shift, but believe me, she made light work of it. She made it look easy. It must have taken her only 20 minutes to dig this massive grave. She then literally rolled her partner's body into the grave very, very slowly, and then jumped in the grave to be with him. She was stroking his body for a very long time, whimpering and touching him, and then finally she jumped out of the grave. It was then that I helped her pile and layer the soil back into the grave, and we began to create a huge burial mound together. The creature then gathered some massively large stones that would have been impossible for a man to lift, but she picked them up with effortless ease as if they weighed nothing, and encircled them around the grave, and finally she picked a couple of sticks and placed them on a grave in what looked like a very deliberate sign. Finally she sat down grievously and continued to whimper. But I used my words to comfort and reassure her, and I even sang her some songs. I think my voice did soothe her, because she looked grateful, and she appeared to be nodding her head in time to my singing. That wasn't very tuneful, I might add. I got up and indicated that I was going away, but I would be coming back very shortly. I rarely sensed she understood what I was trying to communicate, which was amazing, because I'm not the best of actors. At this time it was about 8 in the morning, I imagine, and I thundered excitedly into the main kitchen, like a rhino at full charge, nearly knocking over the shocked chef, who eyed me with a startled, rather bedraggled look on his face. "I've never seen anyone this eager for breakfast before," he said. The cook was preparing breakfast for his distinguished, esteemed guests, because even when it's not hunting season on the estate, they still invariably have guests staying, who book the cabins on the land and enjoy the extracurricular activities on offer, like horse riding, fishing and hiking. The chef who prepares the scrumptious morning buffet breakfasts was rather surprised to see me piling plastic lunch boxes with copious amounts of crispy bacon, ham, cheeses, scrambled eggs, warm crisp potato wedges, sliced fruit, crisp vegetables, guacamole and cereals, not to mention bottles of juice. I told the surprised chef that I was having a picnic, who regarded me as if I was a starved prisoner of war being exposed to food for the first time. "You must be hungry," he said. "That's enough for 20 people." "I'm starved," I lied. "I could eat for 20 people." I then proceeded to scurry out of the kitchen as fast as I could, very, very eagerly, so much so that a few eyes watched me racing out with my hands loaded with food parcels. I did happen to overhear conversations of people asking each other if they had heard gunshots at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and it did seem to appear that indeed gunshots had not escaped the people's staying attention. I said nothing and ran into the woods, where the female creature was sitting by her partner's grave, and she had been expecting me and waiting patiently. When I opened the plastic containers, she was chattering away excitedly, looking absolutely jubilant. She opened the plastic containers eagerly, like a kid unwrapping Christmas presents at Christmas, and opened each container as if she couldn't wait to see what was inside. She let out a very excited whoop, which made me laugh. I could sense her jubilation, and we sat under the oak tree, eagerly eating together. And I've never ever eaten with anyone that appreciated every mouthful as much as this creature did. When she ate the crispy bacon, she looked at me with her golden eyes, and they lit up with pleasure, and she moaned with ecstasy when she ate the bacon, eggs, potatoes and hams that she just absolutely loved. We sat there for ages enjoying each other's company as if we'd been friends all our lives. The creature was ravenously hungry and literally licked the plastic containers completely clean. And then she handed them back to me, but I showed her how you could use the Tupperware containers to keep stuff in, and then she understood what I was trying to tell her. She decided that she would keep the containers as a gift. She was so pleased, she picked up pebbles from the forest floor and shook in the plastic containers rather like a rattle, and looked up at me with bright, rather amused eyes. She was so appreciative and thankful. Finally she indicated that she needed to go, as she pointed towards the mountainous valleys where I imagined she actually lived. It was densely forested up there, with some hilly, rocky ravines. I immediately hugged her, and was enfolded by her massive form, and felt her incredible warmth and love wrapped around me. It was like being in the arms of something that was so big and so loving. It was probably as close as I was ever going to get to feel the love of God around me. I'm not ashamed to say that I started crying because I was so sad to see her go. And I wanted to spend so much more time with her because she enchanted me, and she was so human-like, so accepting, and just so authentic. When I told Peter what had transpired, he was absolutely enraged with me for not waking him up. I did try, I assured him, but you refused to budge. I cannot believe you have such an incredible experience without me, he complained. It's not fair that I missed out. You say the creature looked like a human and an ape. Please can't you take me to her now? What kind of animal do you suppose she is? Oh, please let's go and find her. Look, she's gone home, I said, so you won't be able to see her. I'm really sorry you missed out, but you will sleep in late. You know the saying, the early bird catches the worm. You caught more than a worm, my friend. You saw a humanoid ape, a creature that nobody else has seen. Peter and I decided to leave a large box of delicious food by the grave full of crispy bacon and sumptuous treats, as well as a photograph of me on the box, because I wanted her to look at that photograph and remember me for years to come. And we arranged garlands of flowers around the grave in memory of her fallen partner. I was sure she would come back to visit the grave, retrieve the treats, and be delighted by what we'd done. I did never see the Bigfoot ever again, sadly, but the next day on the doorstep of my cabin, I was to discover the hugest pair of antlers I've ever seen in my life, which I knew immediately was a gift from her. The question that perturbed me for many years to come was how she'd known that I was staying at that particular cabin. Maybe they have a sense of smell, just like dogs do, I don't know. When Peter's uncle actually saw my antlers, he said they were the most impressive antlers he'd ever seen in his life. And today they're still hanging in prime position on my living room wall and attract a lot of questions from guests, but I never ever tell them the story. To cut a long story short, Peter lost his mother to breast cancer 3 years after my encounter with this creature, and my mother and his father actually got together and got married a year after that, I kid you not. It really is extraordinary how life can work out in the funniest and the most peculiar of ways. Peter and I officially became brothers, and all these years later we are still best friends. And our wives, believe it or not, are both sisters from the same family, which is another peculiar irony of ironies. I am now convinced that there's no such thing as a coincidence in this world of ours, because sometimes things do happen for the very strangest of reasons. The beautiful, majestic creature that I encountered in the woods, I now know to be a Bigfoot, a Yeti, a Sasquatch, or a hairy man. I like to call her a Bigfoot. I hope she has found another partner and raised her own family by now. I got the impression that she was young when I met her, so I'm sure she could have started all over again, and I hope she did. I have no regrets of reaching out to a Bigfoot in her time of insurmountable sorrow and grief, even if the consequences had been far different. So that is my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.